On a July morning in 1982, the Queen of England woke to find a stranger in her bedroom, his hand cut, holding a piece of broken glass. She rang the bell beside her, and the people who came were a housemaid from the corridor and a page who had been out walking the dogs. For 73 years, the most watched marriage in Britain was lived in front of a household of several hundred, in separate bedrooms, in 2 offices with 2 private secretaries, on a public schedule planned by other people in 5-minute blocks. On their 72nd anniversary, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh spent the day 110 miles apart. Almost nobody who stood that close ever said a word. If you like stories, the official record was built to keep quiet, subscribe, and stay with this one to the end. The answer is not where you think it is. Chapter 1. Thousands watched, 7 ever spoke. The royal household is not a metaphor. It is an employer, with departments, payroll, and an annual report. And in the financial year ending in 2023, it employed 517 people on a wage bill of £26.9 million. That figure counts only the core household. It leaves out the police officers of royalty protection, the armed services attached to ceremonial duties, and the estate workers at Sandringham and Balmoral. Add those and the number of men and women who spent their working lives within a few rooms of Elizabeth II and her husband, runs, across 7 decades, into the many thousands. Buckingham Palace alone has 775 rooms. 188 of them are staff bedrooms. The royal yacht carried a crew of about 240 for 44 years. The corridor that runs past the private apartments at Windsor is roughly 500 feet long, and somebody walked it several times a day, every day, for the whole of a reign. These people had job titles of extraordinary specificity. There was a master of the household who ran every meal and every bed in every residence. There was a Lord Chamberlain's office, which staged the ceremonial and the public-facing events, the garden parties and the state visits and the opening of Parliament. There was a private secretary's office, which handled the constitutional work and built the diary. There was a press office. There were pages of the backstairs, footmen, housemaids, dressers, equerries, ladies-in-waiting, a piper, a head groom, a fendersmith at Windsor whose job was the fireplaces. There was a woman whose title was the Queen's housemaid, Windsor Castle, and she was decorated for it. All of them signed the same undertaking. All of them saw the same thing. And across 73 years of marriage, the number of those people who ever gave a first hand, on the record account of Elizabeth and Philip as a couple, in private, is fewer than 10. That is the fact this film is built on, and it is worth being exact about it, because the exactness is what makes it strange. Not fewer than 10 who wrote books, fewer than 10 who ever said anything at all, in any form, to anybody, that can be traced and quoted. There was John Dean, a valet to the Duke of Edinburgh, who published a book about him in the mid-1950s, and whose text is now so hard to obtain that not one line of it is quoted in this film. There was Michael Parker, the Australian naval officer who became Philip's private secretary, who gave interviews until his death in 2001. There was Eileen Parker, his wife, who published a memoir in 1982, and who was a household wife rather than a member of it, which matters. There was Sir Martin Charteris, the Queen's private secretary for a quarter of a century, who wrote no memoir at all and whose single most quoted judgment on the marriage reaches us only because he said it aloud to a biographer who wrote it down. There was Paul Burrell, a footman who became the Queen's own and whose account is contested by the family in the sharpest possible terms. There was Darren McGrady, a chef, who saw the couple from the kitchen and the barbecue rather than the sitting room. And there was Angela Kelly, the dresser, who is the single exception in the whole history of the modern household, the one domestic servant ever authorised to publish, with the Queen's personal blessing, and whose published material is almost entirely about the ending. 7 names. 7. Against thousands of witnesses and 26,600 days of marriage, there is a habit of treating that kind of gap as an absence of evidence, the sort of hole a documentary apologizes for and then fills with speculation. It is the reverse. The silence is not a shortage of material. The silence is the material. It was manufactured, deliberately, over 3/4 of a century, by a system with lawyers at one end and medals at the other, and it worked so completely that the most famous marriage of the 20th century is also one of the least described. The system had a great deal to contain. These were never a private couple who happened to employ staff. This was a woman who woke at 7:30 to a maid drawing her curtains, who was dressed by another woman in an adjoining room, who worked government papers at a desk until 11 at night, who had a serving soldier playing the pipes beneath her window every morning at 9, and who was never, at any hour of any day, more than a few yards from somebody whose living depended on her. Her husband had his own suite in the same wing, his own study fitted out like the bridge of a ship, his own office, his own private secretary, his own diary, and his own staff. 2 people, 2 establishments, 1 marriage, and several hundred people standing between them and the world with instructions to see everything and repeat nothing. The instructions were not vague. In April 1949, the wife of King George VI wrote to the governess who had raised her daughters, laying down the doctrine in a phrase that has outlived everyone involved. People in positions of confidence, she wrote, must be utterly oyster. That letter, and what happened to the woman who ignored it, will come later in this story, because it is the hinge on which the whole household turned. What matters now is the result. By the end of the reign, the man who stood closest to Elizabeth II in her private rooms was a 6'4" page of the backstairs called Paul Wybrew, known below stairs as Tall Paul. He served her for 40 years. He was in the room during one of the most famous security breaches in British history. He walked in her funeral procession. He holds a silver medal from 1993, a further decoration in 2006, another in 2012, a gold medal in 2016, a still higher grade in 2023, and a long service medal with 2 clasps marking 4 decades in the household. He has never given an interview. He has never published a line. He has never made a single public statement about the Queen, about the Duke, or about their marriage. That is what a working confidentiality system looks like when it succeeds. Not a scandal suppressed, but a life described only in decorations. So the question this film asks is narrow and answerable, and it is not the question the newspapers spent 70 years asking. It is not whether there was an affair, because no affair was ever proved, and the one occasion on which the palace commented on the subject will get its single sentence in due course and no more. It is not whether the marriage was happy in some general way, which nobody can measure. The question is simpler and much harder to dodge. The couple lived apart in the most literal, architectural, documented sense. They slept in different rooms. They were briefed by different men. Their public appearances were assembled by a staff working from 2 separate diaries. In the last years of his life, the Duke of Edinburgh based himself largely in a 5-bedroom farmhouse in Norfolk, and on the 20th of November 2019, their 72nd wedding anniversary, he was there, and she was in London holding audiences with the ambassadors of Suriname and the Kyrgyz Republic, 110 miles away. What did the people who watched that arrangement, from a distance of a few feet, for a lifetime, actually think it meant? Because they did answer. Not many of them, and not often, and almost never in the form the press wanted. But the handful who spoke, and the household's own curators, and the family members who were there, all reached for the same explanation, and it is not the 170 years of headlines prepared anyone for. It helps to understand what kind of people these witnesses were, because the popular image of a royal servant, a gossiping figure on the back stairs trading stories for cash, describes almost nobody in this household. The staff of Elizabeth II were, overwhelmingly, career people. They came young, and they stayed. The honours lists that name them read like a catalogue of small, specific, lifelong crafts. A housekeeper at Balmoral Castle, a housemaid at Windsor, palace attendants, a carpet planner whose job was the laying of the carpets for state occasions, a fendersmith who maintained the fire irons, every one of them decorated by the sovereign personally, and not one of them has ever spoken publicly about anything. Even the men at the very top of the Duke of Edinburgh's office fit that description. Sir Brian McGrath, who came to Philip's staff in 1982 and stayed connected to it for more than 30 years, was a master of wine before he arrived. Brigadier Sir Miles Hunt Davis, private secretary for 17 years, was a career Gurkha officer. Brigadier Archie Miller Bakewell, the last of them, came from the Blues and Royals, and then the Scots Guards. These were not courtiers in the powdered sense. They were professional men with careers of their own who took a job at the centre of British public life and then, without exception, declined for the rest of their lives to describe it. The floating version of the household was, if anything, tighter still. The royal yacht carried around 240 men, 20 officers, and 220 ratings known aboard as yachties, and every one of them was personally selected by the commanding officer. Roughly half served a 2-year tour. The rest were hand-picked for permanent service across their whole naval careers, and a great many of them turned down promotion to other ships in order to stay. The result was a phenomenon the crew named themselves. They called it dead man's shoes, waiting for a retirement to open a berth. In 44 years of carrying the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh around the world, in a vessel small enough that the private and the crew quarters were yards apart, not one named member of that crew has ever published an account of their private life aboard. To hear the answer properly, the story has to start in the only period of this marriage when there was no household at all. 2 years, on a small island in the Mediterranean, when the future Queen of England drove her own car to the hairdresser. Chapter 2. The only year with no household. She was born on the 21st of April 1926, the elder daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, and she was not born to be queen. That happened to her at the age of 10 in December 1936, when her uncle gave up the throne and her father became King George VI. From that moment, she was raised inside the machine. A governess, courtiers, a wartime childhood managed for the newsreels. She grew up with no expectation of privacy because she had never had any to lose, and there is no record of her ever complaining about it. He was born in a villa on Corfu on the 10th of June 1921, the only son and 5th child of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark and Princess Alice of Battenberg, and he lost everything before he could walk. In December 1922, after Greece's defeat and his father's arrest and court-martial, the family fled aboard a British cruiser. The story that the infant was carried out of the country in a cot improvised from a fruit box has hardened into legend, and careful writers hedge it, and it is repeated here as what it is. The tale the family told, and the shape of a truth about how little there was left. His mother was born deaf. She suffered a breakdown, was placed in a Swiss sanatorium in 1931, and for roughly 5 years afterwards, her son had almost no contact with her. He was schooled at Cheam, then in Germany under Kurt Hahn, then at Gordonstoun in Scotland after Hahn fled the Nazis and rebuilt his school there. He entered the Naval College at Dartmouth in 1939 and passed out top of his term. His war was real. In March 1941, at 19 years old, aboard a battleship at the Battle of Cape Matapan, he worked the searchlights that lit 2 Italian cruisers for the British guns and was mentioned in dispatches. He was in Tokyo Bay for the Japanese surrender in September 1945. Whatever else he was when he married a princess, he was not a man who had been given things. They married at Westminster Abbey on the 20th of November 1947. The day before, he renounced his Greek and Danish titles, took the surname Mountbatten, and was created Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich. The wedding itself was an austerity affair, held barely 2 years after the war, and the details of it have a rationing-era thrift that is hard to imagine now. The government granted the bride 200 extra clothing coupons for the ivory dress, which was embroidered with 10,000 seed pearls imported from America and carried a train 13 feet long. 2,000 guests sat in the abbey. The couple received something like 2,500 presents and 10,000 telegrams. The official cake stood 9 feet high in 4 tiers. Well-wishers posted the princess their own clothing coupons, and she had to send them back because giving coupons away was against the law. His 3 surviving sisters were not invited because their German marriages made it impossible so soon after the war. His mother came. The former king, the bride's uncle, was not invited either. So he arrived at this marriage with a title granted the day before, a surname borrowed from his mother's family, and 3 sisters left off the guest list. Whatever else can be said about Prince Philip, nothing about his position was inherited. It had all been arranged for him within 24 hours of the ceremony, and then, for a few years, something happened that never happened again. They set up home at Clarence House, a plain house designed by John Nash in the early 1800s, furnished largely out of wedding presents under post-war restrictions, including a bookcase from Queen Mary. Princess Anne was born there on the 15th of August, 1950. It was theirs. It was small enough to be theirs. Better still, from 1949 to 1951, Philip served with the Mediterranean Fleet, and his wife came out to join him. They lived at the Villa Guardamangia near Valletta. He was first lieutenant of 1 destroyer, was promoted lieutenant commander in July 1950, and in September of that year was given the frigate Magpie, his first and only sea command, which he held until July 1951. For those 2 years, the heir to the British throne lived as a serving officer's wife. She drove herself. She went to the hairdresser. She sat in other women's sitting rooms while their husbands were at sea. Every account of the marriage, without exception, describes Malta as the nearest thing to a normal married life Elizabeth ever had. And the reason is not the sunshine or the sailing. It is that in Malta there was no household. There was no master of the household ordering the meals. There was no press office deciding which photographers came near the door. There was no Lord Chamberlain's office building a programme in 5-minute blocks. There was no piper, no page of the backstairs, no equerry, no red box arriving at 7:30 in the evening with the parliamentary business of the day. There were 2 young married people, 2 small children born by the end of it, 1 naval command and a rented villa, 2 children by 1950, a husband with a ship, a wife who could take her own car out of the gate. That is the entire inventory of the only period in a 73-year marriage in which the couple's private life was not physically arranged by other people. It lasted about 2 years, and it ended in July 1951, when Philip took extended leave because his father-in-law was dying and never returned to sea. It is worth naming what that means before the rest of the story buries it. Everything the world would later read as coldness in this marriage, the separate rooms, the separate offices, the man walking a step behind his wife, the 2 houses at the end, none of it existed in Malta. It arrived with the crown, and it arrived within weeks, because the crown arrived with no warning at all. On the 6th of February 1952, the couple were in Kenya at Sagana Lodge, standing in for the ailing king on a Commonwealth tour, having spent the previous night at a lodge called Treetops. At Sandringham, in Norfolk, George VI died. The news came to the party by a roundabout route, and it reached Michael Parker first. Parker was the Australian naval officer who had met Philip in 1942 as young destroyer officers escorting convoys, a friendship formed years before either of them had anything to do with palaces. He had joined the household after the wedding as equerry and then private secretary. He took the news, and he took it to Philip, and Philip broke it to his wife himself. Parker watched him receive it. His account is one of the few first-hand descriptions of a private royal moment that has ever been given by a man who was standing there, and it does not sound like a courtier's line. He looked, Parker said, as if you had dropped half the world on him. And then, in the second half of the same recollection, the sentence that gives the whole reign away. I never felt so sorry for anyone in all my life. Not for the 25-year-old woman who had just become Queen of the United Kingdom. For her husband. That was the instinct of the man closest to him in the first minutes of the new reign, and it is the first thing anyone should understand about the architecture that was about to be built around this marriage. The distinction is not sentimental. It is exact, and the paperwork proves it. Philip was promoted to commander on the 30th of June 1952, 4 months into his wife's reign, and never went to sea again. Senior officers who had watched his career were said to believe he could have reached the top of the Royal Navy had he stayed in it, a judgment attributed to senior officers, though never more than an opinion. He was 30 years old. He had earned every rank he held, and the profession he had built from nothing, as a stateless boy with no money and no country, was closed to him in an afternoon by an event neither he nor his wife had chosen. His own summary of the vacancy he inherited instead is the flattest thing he ever said about it. There was no precedent, he explained years later. If he asked somebody what they expected him to do, they all looked blank. Look at what happened over the following weeks, and the pattern is unmistakable. She landed in London at 4 in the afternoon on the 7th of February 1952 and was met at the airport by the Prime Minister. The machinery of the reign closed around her at once. A private secretary's office, an accession council, an entire constitutional apparatus that had been waiting her whole life for that hour and knew precisely what to do with her. Nothing at all had been prepared for him. There was no department of the household for a male consort to a female sovereign, because there had not been one in living memory. There was no job description because there was no job. So the two of them walked into the same building and were handed opposite things. She was given a role so complete it would consume every day of the next 70 years. He was given a title, a place immediately behind her in every procession, and a study. She had inherited a job. He had lost one. Chapter 3. A floor plan drawn for somebody else. She landed back in London at 4 in the afternoon on the 7th of February 1952, and by the end of that year, almost every physical circumstance of her marriage had been rearranged by people other than herself. The first and largest of those changes was the address. Neither of them wanted to leave Clarence House. The biographer, Penny Junor, records the family view plainly. None of them wanted to go. They loved Clarence House. It was a family home. The new queen would have preferred to stay. Debrett states flatly that her husband resisted the move, and it made no difference. Junor records that Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister, insisted on the move, and to Buckingham Palace they went. For a period in the early 1950s, while the private apartments in the north wing were prepared, the couple were housed in the Belgian suite on the ground floor of the garden wing. It is worth being precise about that suite, because it is one of the most commonly misdescribed rooms in Britain. It is not the royal private apartment, and never has been. It is the state guest suite, named after King Leopold I of the Belgians, who stayed in it so often. It contains rooms decorated for the visits of foreign sovereigns. Presidents of the United States have slept there. Edward VIII briefly occupied it in 1936. Prince Andrew was born in it on the 19th of February 1960. Then they moved upstairs, into the first floor of the north wing, and into the shape of the rest of their lives. Here it is necessary to be careful, because there is no published floor plan of the sovereign's private apartments. Buckingham Palace has never released one, and the diagrams that circulate under that description are commercial reconstructions drawn by an architect working from public sources. What can be established comes from official reference material, from the royal collection, and from the small number of people who have described what they saw. What can be established is this. The sovereign's private apartments are in the north wing. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh occupied a large suite of rooms on its first floor. Within that suite, the Queen used comparatively few rooms with any regularity: a bedroom, a private sitting room, a dressing room and bathroom, and the audience room where she received her ministers. And within the same suite, her husband had a discrete set of rooms of his own, including a study. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story, and the press has spent 70 years blurring it. Separate apartments, in newspaper usage, sounds like two households at opposite ends of a building. A husband and wife who have divided a palace between them the way a failing couple divides a house. That is not what the record describes. The record describes one private suite, containing rooms for both of them, adjoining. His study is the best documented room in the whole arrangement because it was filmed. In a documentary broadcast on the 22nd of September 2021, 5 months after his death, the family walked a camera through it. There was a large wooden desk, a green chair, yellow curtains, equestrian bronzes, a portrait of George VI and his wife, given to Philip as a wedding present in 1947, and still on the wall, 74 years later, a television, an electric control panel for the curtains, because of course there was. His son Andrew described the way it was laid out. Like the bridge of a ship, he said. Everything in reach. The room also survives in the royal collection twice over, in a watercolour by Sir Hugh Casson, made as a study of the Duke of Edinburgh's room at Buckingham Palace, and in a second work showing the Duke himself sitting in it. A man who had been raised in other people's houses, who had spent his war on ships, and who had just been informed that his career was over at 30, built himself a room laid out like a command deck and stayed in it for the next 7 decades. The other residences repeat the pattern with variations. At Windsor, the private apartments are in the upper ward in the 19th century section, reached along the Grand Corridor, which runs about 500 feet. The named rooms that survive in archival photography include the Oak Room, a semi-octagonal room panelled in white painted oak that the Queen used as a sitting room, along with a writing room, an audience chamber, a boudoir, a bedroom, and a dressing room. At Sandringham, the private floors are not documented at all, and this film will not pretend otherwise. At Balmoral, the same is true, apart from a tartan-carpeted office shown in a television documentary in 2016, with a small electric heater in front of the fireplace and a row of dog beds in front of the credenza. And then there is Holyrood House, which is the closest anyone has come to an official answer. In 2026, marking the centenary of her birth, the Royal Collection Trust opened 3 rooms of the late Queen's private suite at the Palace of Holyrood House to the public for 100 days. The rooms are on the east side. The Trust's own description of them is the highest grade evidence that exists on this subject, because it is the household describing itself. There is a sitting room, which is where, in the Trust's words, the late Queen would work, reviewing the papers and documents presented in the government red dispatch boxes. Red sofas set to catch the garden view, a television on which she followed the racing, and the artwork on the walls of that room, the room where she did her constitutional work, reflects her husband's taste for contemporary Scottish painting. And there is a royal breakfast room, which is described, in the household's own curatorial language, as the room where the Queen and Prince Philip would dine privately while in residence. Hold that against the headlines for a moment. The first official presentation of the private life of Elizabeth II, prepared by her own institution, consists of a working room hung with her husband's pictures and a room in which the two of them ate alone together. There is no bedroom on the tour. But the bedrooms are where this story has to go, because the bedrooms are the fact everybody thinks they already understand, and the evidence about them is both stranger and better than the version in circulation. Before that, though, one more piece of the architecture has to be put in place, and it is the piece the public has never absorbed at all. One more feature of these houses deserves recording, because it explains why so much of what follows had to be reconstructed rather than simply reported. The private apartments are the only part of the royal estate that has never been shown. Buckingham Palace opens its staterooms to the public every summer. Windsor opens the state apartments and the chapel. Sandringham opens the ground floor of the house, the great saloon, and the drawing rooms, and the ballroom, and the dining room, and nothing above it. Balmoral shows a ballroom and some gardens. Every one of those tours stops at precisely the same line, and the line is the door to the rooms where these two people actually lived. The one room of the Buckingham Palace private apartments the Queen ever allowed to be photographed was the audience room, a pale blue sitting room in which she received her ministers. In other words, the only interior of her private life ever released was the room in which she did her most public work. Everything else is inference. The photographs that circulate as palace floor plans are commercial reconstructions drawn by an architect from publicly available material. The confident room-by-room accounts in the press are compilations of compilations. The film that showed the family at home was made in 1969 and has been unavailable, in practice, since 1977. What exists, in the end, is a study filmed after Philip's death, 3 rooms at Holyrood House opened after hers, and the memories of people who signed a contract promising not to describe them. Which is why the next fact matters so much, because it is one of the very few features of this marriage that was not private at all. It was published in the household's own literature for 70 years, and almost nobody noticed what it meant. From the moment his wife became queen, Prince Philip did not simply have his own rooms. He had his own office, his own staff, and his own diary. And for the next 69 years, the man and the woman at the centre of British public life were briefed every morning by 2 different people who worked in 2 different rooms. Chapter 4. The husband got his own office. The household of the Duke of Edinburgh existed as a separate establishment from the accession in 1952 until his death in 2021. It had its own private secretary, its own correspondence, its own staff, and its own programme. It was not a wing of the Queen's office. It was a parallel institution inside the same building. The line of men who ran it is a short one, and every name in it served for a long time. Michael Parker held the desk from 1947 until 1957. James Orr succeeded him. Later came Lord Rupert Neville, and then Sir Brian McGrath, who joined the office in 1982, was private secretary and treasurer from 1984 to 1992, head of the household from 1993 to 1995, and an extra equerry from 1996, an association of more than 30 years. After him came Brigadier Sir Miles Hunt Davis, who joined in 1991 and was private secretary from 1993 to 2010, about 17 years. And last, Brigadier Archie Miller Bakewell, private secretary and treasurer from 2010 to 2021. 6 men in 70 years. Nobody left in a hurry. What that structure meant in practice is the part worth sitting with. When the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh appeared together at an engagement, they had not planned it together. Her office had planned her part, and his office had planned his, and the two programmes had been meshed by staff into a single afternoon. The royal household's own published description of his role uses a revealing phrase. He accompanied her whenever feasible, it says, and on certain occasions he undertook parallel engagement schedules to enhance the Queen's programme. Parallel engagement schedules. 2 people sent in different directions on the same day to cover more ground, and then brought back together for the photograph. The formal position was settled early. In September 1952, 6 months after the accession, the Queen declared that the Duke of Edinburgh should have place, preeminence and precedence next to Her Majesty on all occasions and in all meetings, except where otherwise provided by Act of Parliament. That is a statement about rank. It says he comes immediately after her and before everybody else in the country. It says nothing whatsoever about how many paces behind her he should walk, and it is worth killing that particular myth now rather than later. There is no located palace rule, warrant or order prescribing a number of paces. Every version of the claim, 2 paces, 3 paces, a step, traces back to commentary rather than to any household document. What existed was a convention, and it was not even absolute. Photographs across the whole reign show the 2 of them side by side and arm in arm at engagements that were not ceremonial. The convention had one formal moment, and it was enormous. At the coronation, on the 2nd of June 1953, in front of the Abbey and the cameras, her husband knelt in front of her as her first subject and swore the homage. I, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship, and faith and truth I will bear unto you, to live and die against all manner of folks, a man kneeling to his wife, by law, on television. Whatever else the arrangement of this marriage was, it had a constitutional inversion at its centre that no amount of household planning could soften, and it had a wound. In 1952, the question of the family surname was raised and settled against him. On the 9th of April 1952, the Queen declared that the house would remain Windsor. Philip's counter-proposal, the House of Edinburgh, was refused. His reported private reaction is recorded by his biographer Giles Brandreth, and because it is a reported private remark rather than a document, it should always be attributed to him, that he was nothing but a bloody amoeba, the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. A partial peace came only on the 8th of February 1960, when an order in council confirmed that male line descendants without royal styles would carry the surname Mountbatten Windsor. It was issued 11 days before Prince Andrew was born. That episode has been told at length elsewhere, and it is not the subject here. It matters in this story for one reason only, and it is a reason about rooms. Put together what happened to this man between February 1952 and April of the same year. He lost his naval career, which he had earned entirely on his own merits, and which was, by the judgment of senior officers, heading somewhere. He lost the house he liked. He was moved into a palace he disliked, whose private wing had been laid out in the previous century for a different sovereign and a different consort. He was told his children would not carry his name. He was given no constitutional function of any kind, a fact he summarized in the driest 4 words he ever spoke, as, "Constitutionally, I do not exist." Michael Parker, who watched all of it happen from the next desk, put it in terms that leave nothing to interpretation. Philip, he said, was constantly being squashed, snubbed, ticked off, rapped over the knuckles. It was intolerable. And on the change of address, Parker drew the contrast that explains everything that followed. At Clarence House, it was very much his show, and when they got to Buckingham Palace, all that changed. So the man built a territory. He took the estates, running Sandringham from 1952 and holding a lifelong hand in Balmoral. He took the household's machinery and set about making it efficient, which delighted nobody who had been there before him. He took an office, a study fitted like a bridge, a library, a diary of his own, and a set of rooms within his wife's suite that were unmistakably his. Seen from the outside, that looks like a marriage dividing into 2. Seen from the inside, with the dates laid alongside each other, it looks like the only available response of a 30-year-old man who has just been told that the whole of his own life has been cancelled and that his new job has no description. And the territory was not decorative. Given charge of Sandringham in 1952 and made Ranger of Windsor Great Park in the same year, he set about the estates with the exactness of a man who had spent his formative years being measured against a standard. Over the following decades, the changes were catalogued. At Sandringham, more than 100 miles of field margins and upwards of 5,000 trees planted every year. At Balmoral, a hydroelectric scheme and enclosed woodland expanded from 20 hectares in the 1970s to 300 by 1992. At Windsor, a farm shop opened in 2001. He turned the same attention on the household itself. The press secretary Charles Anson, who worked for the Queen in the 1990s, summarised the project in a sentence. Philip wanted to make the royal household and the monarchy less stuffy, not to have so much formality everywhere. The biographer Ingrid Seward records that when his wife became queen, he saw that the household was run in a very inefficient way, and being an extremely efficient man, he set about sweeping changes to make it more efficient, which made him a little bit unpopular with the courtiers already in place. That last clause is worth holding on to. The reforms have been retold so often, and embroidered with so many stories of intercoms and reorganised kitchens and telephones installed against the objections of an older generation, that the substance has become hard to separate from the folklore. The specific gadgets belong to the biographies and should be attributed to them. The substance is beyond argument. An outsider with a naval officer's contempt for waste walked into an aristocratic court and started timing it, and the court did not enjoy the experience. Seward also recorded the line he offered whenever anyone asked what he thought he was for. "My duty is to support my wife as monarch," he said, and by every account it was the position he never once moved from. By the middle of the 1950s, the arrangement was complete. 2 suites in one wing, 2 offices, 2 private secretaries, 2 diaries, 1 marriage, and several hundred people employed to hold it together and say nothing. And in the middle of it, a few feet of 1 private suite, separating his rooms from hers. Chapter 5. Separate rooms and the door between them. The most repeated fact about this marriage is true. They did not share a bedroom. It is documented from the very beginning, before the crown, before the palace, before any of the pressures that are usually blamed for it. And the earliest witness to it was a servant. The biographer Philip Eade, writing about the young Prince Philip, records the arrangement at Clarence House in the late 1940s in a single sentence that has been quoted 1,000 times with its second half amputated. Philip had his own bedroom next door to Elizabeth's, Eade writes, an arrangement common to a great many upper-class couples at that time. Next door. Not at the far end of a corridor, not in a separate wing, not in another house. Next door. And Ide adds a phrase that the retellings almost never carry because it complicates the story they want to tell. The couple, he writes, enjoyed the visitation rituals which that system involves. There is one recorded instance of those rituals, and it comes from inside the household. The valet James MacDonald walked in, early in the marriage, and found Princess Elizabeth in Prince Philip's bed. Ede's account is precise about the awkwardness. She was wearing her usual silk nightgown, and her husband appeared to be naked. Ede also records that Philip did not care at all about being discovered, since he habitually slept without pyjamas. That story reaches us second-hand, through a biographer, and MacDonald never gave a first-person account of it, and it should always be attributed accordingly. But its shape is worth noticing. The one time a member of staff is recorded as having walked in on the sleeping arrangements of the future Queen of England, what he found was the wife in the husband's bed. Now to the person best placed to explain what any of it meant. Lady Pamela Hicks was Lord Mountbatten's daughter and Philip's cousin. She was a bridesmaid at the wedding in 1947. She was a lady-in-waiting on the Kenya tour in 1952, standing a few feet away in the hours when Elizabeth became queen. She is family. She is not a journalist, and she has no book to sell about this. She gave her account to the biographer Sally Bedell Smith, and it is the single most useful thing anybody has ever said on the subject. In England, she said, the upper class always have had separate bedrooms. You do not want to be bothered with snoring or someone flinging a leg around. Then when you are feeling cozy, you share your room sometimes. It is lovely to be able to choose. Read that again, and then notice what happens to it in the retelling. The newspapers run the first sentence. Sometimes they run the joke about the snoring. They stop there, at the point where the quotation supports the story they came for, and they cut the two sentences that follow. Then when you are feeling cozy, you share your room sometimes. It is lovely to be able to choose. That is not a description of a couple who live apart. It is a description of a couple with two doors and a preference. The convention itself is attested by three entirely separate categories of witness, which is rare and worth weighing. There is family in Lady Pamela Hicks. There is a biographer working from the record in Philip Ede, who calls it an arrangement common to a great many upper-class couples at that time. And there is the royal journalist Ingrid Seward, editor of a magazine devoted to the family and author of a book on this exact marriage, who described it on daytime television during the 70th anniversary week in November 2017. All three frame it as class practice. Not one of them frames it as marital. And Seward goes further, in a direction almost nobody follows her in. She does not merely say the separation was normal, she disputes that it was a separation at all. They have a bedroom together, she said, and as a lot of aristocratic people used to do, the man has his own bedroom. If he is sick, if he has had a late night, or he has been out with the boys. A shared bedroom, plus an additional room for the husband. That is a materially different arrangement from the one in circulation, and it comes from a woman who has spent her working life inside this subject. There is no honest way to settle the disagreement between Ede and Seward from the outside, and this film is not going to pretend to. What can be said is that two serious sources, who have both looked closely, disagree about which room the couple slept in, and that neither of them thinks the answer says anything at all about whether the marriage was working. That is a more interesting position than certainty. What can also be said, and needs saying because it is the honest limit of the evidence, is how thin the ground under all of this is. There is no published floor plan. There is no verifiable source for a connecting door at Buckingham Palace. The only next-door testimony is Eads, and it describes Clarence House. Sources that place their Windsor bedrooms in one tower or another cannot be checked, and the tower usually named belonged to Queen Victoria's apartments, not theirs. Not one of the household names most often quoted on this subject in the press, and there are half a dozen of them, can actually be shown to have said anything about it. So the defensible statement is a modest one, and it is more than enough. Adjoining rooms within one private suite for the whole of a reign. There is one further piece of evidence about those rooms, and it arrived by accident, in the form of a burglary. At around 6 o'clock on the morning of the 9th of July, 1982, a man called Michael Fagan climbed the perimeter wall of Buckingham Palace and went up a drainpipe. A sensor fired and was switched off by police as faulty. He then wandered the corridors for several minutes before he reached the royal apartments, and in an anteroom on the way, he broke a glass ashtray and cut his hand on it. At about 7:15, he walked into the Queen's bedroom, carrying a fragment of that glass. She woke because he disturbed a curtain. By his own account, given 30 years later, she ran, barefoot and quickly. She telephoned the palace switchboard twice. She used the alarm bell beside her bed. She beckoned a housemaid who was in the corridor outside. And then help came. It came in the form of Paul Wybrew, the page of the back stairs, who had been out walking the dogs, and 2 police officers on palace duty behind him, and between them, they took the man out of the room. The reliable record of that morning says nothing whatsoever about where Prince Philip was. And this film will not claim otherwise, because a great many accounts do, and none of them can show their working. What the record establishes is narrower and colder than the version people repeat. When the sovereign of the United Kingdom woke to find a stranger in her bedroom, the people who came were a housemaid from the corridor and a page walking the dogs. That is the household. That is what it was for. And it is the reason that everything anyone can know about the private life of this marriage has to come through people who were paid to be there, sworn to say nothing, and decorated for keeping to it. There is one more thing worth saying about the separate bedrooms, and it is the argument that ought to end the discussion entirely. Separate bedrooms are not evidence of anything. They occur in this marriage, which lasted 73 years, and which every close witness describes as strong. They occur in other marriages of the same class and generation that ended in public disaster. The same domestic arrangement sits inside the most successful royal marriage of the century and inside the most disastrous one. A fact that is equally present in both cannot be used to diagnose either. Nor is the convention as universal as the retellings suggest. The idea that royal couples have always slept apart is itself a simplification. Plenty did not. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert are the standing counterexample everybody reaches for. Among the couple's own descendants, the practice appears to have gone the other way. Prince William, at a college in Cornwall in 2024, was overheard telling a local radio presenter that the family dog sleeps on the bed at night with him and his wife. 2 generations, 2 arrangements, and no conclusion available from either. So the honest position on the most famous fact about this marriage is that it is real, that it was ordinary for their class and generation, that at least one serious biographer disputes even the basic version of it, and that it tells you nothing at all on its own, which raises the question the evidence can actually answer about those 2 adjoining rooms. Who walked through it, and how often? Chapter 6. She came to his room for breakfast. Every morning, for decades, the Queen of the United Kingdom left her own rooms and went into her husband's and ate cereal out of a plastic tub. Before that sentence is allowed to do any work, its source has to be declared. because the honesty of this film depends on doing that out loud. Almost everything anyone knows about the domestic routine of Elizabeth II and Prince Philip comes from one man, and he was not a servant. He was Ryan Parry, a reporter for a national newspaper who obtained a job as a footman at Buckingham Palace under false pretenses and worked inside the household for about 2 months in 2003 before publishing what he had seen. The roundups and compilations that circulate today, the ones that describe the tea tray and the marmalade and the radio, are all downstream of him. That publication ended, as this story will show later, in the High Court. The details survived the case, and it is what the record has. So here is the day, with that warning attached to every line of it. At around 7:30, a maid came in with Earl Grey tea on a silver tray, with hot water, milk, biscuits, and bone china, carrying the royal cipher. She drew the curtains and switched on the radio. While the Queen bathed, her dresser laid out the first outfit of the day in the adjoining dressing room. Notice who is in that sequence. A maid wakes her. A dresser works next door. The room adjoining the sovereign's bedroom, at the start of every day of her adult life, was a dressing room. At 9 o'clock, precisely, the piper to the sovereign began to play beneath her window and played for 15 minutes. He did it every weekday, at whichever residence she was in, at Buckingham Palace, or Windsor, or Holyrood House, or Balmoral. The post is a real one, and the men who held it are named. Pipe Major Scott Methven from Stirling, an army veteran of Afghanistan, held it from 2015 to 2019 and called it one of the most coveted jobs in the piping world. Under her window, singular, not under theirs. The architecture of this marriage was asymmetrical by constitution long before it was asymmetrical by choice, and a soldier stood outside every morning to prove it. At around 9:30, she was at her desk, a Chippendale desk with 2 inkwells, black ink for official documents and green for personal letters. 200 to 300 letters arrived every day. The government red dispatch boxes came with them, carrying cabinet papers, foreign office telegrams, and parliamentary summaries requiring her signature. At 7:30 in the evening, a written report of the day's business in Parliament arrived from a government whip and was read at once. She worked the boxes late into the night and went to bed, as a rule, around 11. That routine is not decoration. It is the real explanation for the separate bedroom, and it is duller and more convincing than any rift. A woman who is woken at 7:30 by a servant, who is piped at 9, who has state papers on her desk until 11 at night, and who has done that every working day since the age of 25, has an operational reason for a room of her own that has nothing whatever to do with the man she married. Any reading of those 2 doors that ignores the dispatch boxes has not looked at the job. And in the middle of that day, at around 8:30 in the morning, between the tea tray and the desk, comes the detail that quietly takes the whole rift theory apart. They ate breakfast together, every day, in a first-floor room overlooking the garden, described as the morning room, and the morning room formed part of Prince Philip's suite. She went to him. There was cereal, kept in plastic tubs, a plate of fruit, Earl Grey, honey and maple syrup, toast with a light marmalade, which was frequently fed to the dogs rather than eaten, and on the table, positioned between the yogurt and the fruit bowl, an old-fashioned transistor radio belonging to the Duke of Edinburgh. Hold that image against 70 years of headlines. A queen and a consort, in his rooms, in the morning, with a plastic tub of cereal and a battered radio between the yogurt and the fruit. The rest of the day pulled them apart again, because the job pulled them apart. At Buckingham Palace, she typically lunched alone, occasionally with a lady in waiting. Every 2 months, they hosted informal lunches together for a dozen guests drawn from all sorts of backgrounds, an innovation of his. In the afternoon, there were engagements and audiences, and on Wednesdays in session, the Prime Minister at 6:30. And then, in the evening, on the nights when nothing was scheduled, the household record produces its warmest detail, and it comes from a man who was there. Darren McGrady joined the royal kitchens in 1982 and spent 11 years in the Queen's household at Buckingham Palace, Windsor, Sandringham and Balmoral, before going to work for the Princess of Wales. He is a genuine witness to how these two people ate, which in a household is not a small window. Prince Philip, he said, has a much broader palate than Her Majesty when it comes to food. And on the evenings when they wanted to be left alone, they were left alone in the most specific way available to people who live in a palace. They dismissed the servants, and Philip cooked. Scrambled eggs with smoked haddock, mushrooms sautéed in butter with bacon, Scotch woodcock, which is scrambled egg with anchovies on toast, an omelette with bacon. He made his own breakfast most mornings, bacon and eggs and sausages and sometimes kidneys, and he travelled with an electric frying pan with a glass lid so that he could go on making it wherever he was. At Balmoral, the same instinct scaled up into a ritual. He grilled outdoors as often as 5 times a week when the family was there. He chose the produce from the garden himself and came into the kitchen to ask what the meat might be marinated in and what vegetables were ready. McGrady's description of those meals is the least royal sentence in this entire story. Each meal was simple, he said, and often seasonal, without pomp and ceremony. They worked as a family on creating this meal, which they loved. They were not afraid to let their hair down. There is a piece of film of exactly that, and it is the only footage of its kind that exists, and the reason it exists at all is a decision taken in 1969 that the family would spend the next 50 years regretting. That story is coming. For now, hold the shape of the day, because it is the shape of the marriage. 2 bedrooms, 1 breakfast in his rooms, taken by a woman who walked through the door to get there. A day of separate diaries built by separate offices, and an evening in which the 2 most attended people in Britain sent every attendant out of the room so that a man in his 80s could stand at a stove and cook for his wife. Whatever that is, it is not what the word estranged usually means. There is a coda to the domestic routine that belongs here, because it is the one place the couple's private arrangements were ever set out by the institution itself, rather than by a reporter in a borrowed uniform. In 2026, to mark the centenary of her birth, the Royal Collection Trust opened 3 rooms of the late Queen's private suite at the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh for 100 days between May and September. It was the first time any part of her private apartments anywhere had been shown to the public. The Trust described the rooms as offering a rare glimpse into the personal, lived-in spaces used during private moments between official duties. There are 3 of them. A dressing room, displaying among other things a tweed coat and crepe dress she wore to host a garden party during Royal Week in 2017. A sitting room, described by the Trust as the room where the late Queen would work, reviewing the papers and documents presented in the government red dispatch boxes, with red sofas placed to catch the garden view and a television on which she followed the racing. And the artwork hanging in that working room, the Trust notes, reflects Prince Philip's taste for contemporary Scottish painting. And then the 3rd room, the Royal Breakfast Room, which the Trust describes, in its own words, as the room where the Queen and Prince Philip would dine privately while in residence. It is hung with mid-17th century Flemish tapestries installed by George V and Queen Mary in the 1920s, and it displays simple cookware. Read the 3 descriptions in sequence, and something quietly extraordinary emerges. The first official presentation of the private life of Elizabeth II, prepared by her own institution and released 4 years after her death, consists of the clothes she wore to work, a room where she did state papers surrounded by her husband's pictures, and a room where the 2 of them ate alone together. There is no bedroom on the tour. There never has been, anywhere. And the institution that has spent a century refusing to describe this marriage chose, when it finally described anything at all, to describe a shared table. But the routine only tells you what they did. It does not tell you what they were like, and for that, there were only ever a handful of men in the world who could have said, and one of them did. Chapter 7. The only man who treated her as a person. Consider the position she occupied. From the age of 25, every person Elizabeth II met had been briefed about how to meet her. They had been told when to bow, how to address her, when to speak, when to withdraw. Prime ministers arrived on Wednesdays and stood until invited to sit. Servants backed out of rooms. Ambassadors rehearsed. 500 people in her own employment were trained, in one way or another, to treat her as an institution rather than a woman, and most of them had waited their whole careers for the privilege. There was one exception in the entire world, and a courtier watched it for 25 years. Sir Martin Charteris was private secretary to Princess Elizabeth from 1950, assistant private secretary to the Queen from 1952, and her private secretary from 1972 until 1977, after which he became provost of Eton. He was at the top of the household, not below stairs, and he saw the couple almost every working day for a quarter of a century. He never wrote a memoir. The single most important sentence anyone in royal service ever said about this marriage reaches the world only because he said it to the biographer Giles Brandreth, who wrote it down, and every honest telling of it has to carry that qualification. Charteris told Brandreth, he did not publish it, he did not sign it, and he cannot be asked about it now. Prince Philip, he said, is the only man in the world who treats the Queen simply as another human being. He is the only man who can. Strange as it may seem, I believe she values that. There is the whole marriage in 3 sentences, from a man who watched it at close range and had no reason to flatter either of them, and it reframes every architectural fact in this story. In a house where 500 people were paid to treat her as the crown, the value of the man in the adjoining room was that he did not. The door between those 2 rooms was the door the only ordinary conversation of her life came through. Not the only affection, necessarily. The only ordinariness. The men who ran his side of the arrangement understood the job in exactly those terms, and the first of them said so. Michael Parker was Australian, born in Melbourne on the 23rd of June 1920. He met Philip in 1942, when they were both young destroyer officers escorting convoys, and the friendship was formed between equals years before either of them was anything at all. After the wedding, he joined the household as equerry and then as private secretary to the Duke of Edinburgh, a post he held from 1947 to 1957. And on the accession, he effectively ran Philip's office and organised his travel. Parker's account of the terms on which he was hired is the plainest statement of what Philip believed his job to be, and it is worth hearing in his own words. He told me the first day he offered me my job, Parker said, that his job, first, second, and last, was never to let her down. First, second, and last. A man with no constitutional function, no career of his own left, and no say in his children's surname, defining his entire life's work in a single clause, out loud, to a subordinate in the 1940s, and then keeping to it for 73 years. Parker also saw what it cost. and he is the source of the sharpest description anyone has left of Philip's early years inside the palace. Philip was constantly being squashed, snubbed, ticked off, rapped over the knuckles, he said. It was intolerable. There was a wider circle of men around the Duke in that period, and its most famous outpost was a weekly lunch. The Thursday Club met at Wheeler's Oyster Restaurant in Old Compton Street in Soho, an all-male gathering founded by the society photographer Baron Nahum. It has been carrying an enormous amount of innuendo ever since, and Parker, who was a member, dealt with it directly. They enjoyed fun, he said, and going round with people who knew what was going on. The Thursday Club was a great sounding base, and the idea that it was a drunken orgy was absolute rubbish. Nothing beyond that has ever been established about the club, and nothing beyond that will be said here. After Parker, the men who held the Duke's office stayed for a very long time, and the tenures themselves are a kind of evidence. Sir Brian McGrath, who had been a master of wine before he came to the household, joined the office in 1982, was private secretary and treasurer from 1984 to 1992, head of the household from 1993 to 1995, and remained an extra equerry from 1996. More than 30 years of association. He wrote nothing and gave no substantive public account of the marriage. Brigadier Sir Miles Hunt Davis, a career Gurkha officer, joined in 1991 and served as private secretary from 1993 to 2010. 17 years. He wrote nothing and gave no interviews about the Duke or the marriage. His only substantial published interview concerned conservation work. Brigadier Archie Miller Bakewell served as private secretary and treasurer from 2010 to 2021, through the retirement and to the end. He registered the Duke's death. He has made no public statement of any kind. And alongside them stood the two men who did the physical work of his last years, his page William Henderson and his valet Stephen Nidoyadlo. Neither has ever given an interview. No quotation from either exists anywhere on the record, and what is known of them comes almost entirely from the fact that he remembered them in his will. On the Queen's side of the arrangement, the picture is the same, with one exception. Angela Kelly came into royal service in 1993 and stayed until the Queen's death in 2022. Her formal title was Personal Assistant, Advisor and Curator to Her Majesty the Queen, covering the jewellery, the insignia and the wardrobe. And it understates what she was, which was the closest thing the Queen had in her later years to a friend on the payroll. She dressed her. She travelled with her. She was one of the small group who isolated with the couple at Windsor during the pandemic, which put her in the same house as this marriage for the last year of it. And she is the single exception in the entire modern history of the household, because in 2019 she published a book with the Queen's personal blessing. That authorization is documented, and it is extraordinary. In a system that had gone to the High Court to stop a footman, the Sovereign personally approved a member of her domestic staff writing about her. What is striking is what the permission covered. The book is about clothes. It is warm, it is careful. And about the marriage it says almost nothing at all. It was only in an updated edition, published after Philip died, that Kelly wrote about the couple directly. And even then, what she described was not the marriage, but its ending. The single exception, granted once in 75 years, produced a book about hats. There is a coda to that, and it belongs here rather than later. After the Queen's death, it was reported that the new king required Kelly to sign a non-disclosure agreement, preventing a third book, with a reported arrangement involving a cottage for life. The claim that she holds a letter from the late Queen, authorizing 3 volumes, comes from unnamed friends through a newspaper and is not established. What is established is the shape of the thing. The one authorized voice in the household was authorized by one monarch and closed down by the next. There is a pattern in those careers, and it can be counted, because the household made it countable. The Royal Victorian Order is awarded for distinguished service to the monarch. It was the first order of chivalry given at the sole discretion of the sovereign, and it operates entirely outside the jurisdiction of government. There are 5 grades, from the highest knighthood down, and beneath them a medal in gold, silver and bronze for domestic staff, and beside them a separate long and faithful service medal with clasps at 20 years, 30 years and 40 years. Follow one man's decorations and the system becomes visible. Hunt Davis received a commandership in 1998, a knighthood in the order in 2003, and its highest grade on his retirement in 2010. Follow another at the opposite end of the household, and the ladder is identical in shape. Paul Wybrew, the page, took a silver medal in 1993, a first grade in 2006, a higher one in 2012, a gold medal in 2016, a commandership in 2023, and a long service medal with 2 clasps for 40 years. Nothing in that system is given for talking. Everything in it is given for not. There is a second body of testimony about what these 2 people were like together, and it needs handling with more care than it usually gets, because it does not come from servants at all. It comes from authors. The rows in this marriage are famous. They have been recycled for decades, and the details are vivid. That he called her a bloody fool, that he told her she was talking rubbish, that he drove fast enough to alarm her and once threatened to put her out of the car. Almost all of that reaches the public through the royal author Ingrid Seward, and it should be attributed to her every time it is used, because the witnesses underneath it are not identified. It is her account, honestly given, from a lifetime inside the subject, and it is not the same thing as a servant saying what he saw. The biographer, Sarah Bradford, was told something similar by an unnamed friend of the family. "He shouts at the Queen sometimes like he shouts at other people," the friend said, and she does not seem to mind. Set beside those, and considerably better sourced, is an account from a man who actually worked in the household. Chief Petty Officer William Evans, a royal servant, described an incident from when the Queen was in her mid-30s, so somewhere around the early 1960s. Philip chased her, growling at her to get up there. "Girl, get up there," and pinched her. And Evans recorded the sovereign of the United Kingdom screaming with laughter and shouting at him to stop it. "Philip, stop it, stop it, stop it." That is not the marriage of the newspaper headlines, and it is not the marriage of the state portraits either. It is 2 people in their middle years, somewhere in a palace, behaving like anybody's parents. And there is a great deal of material in circulation that does not meet even that standard, and is left out of this film deliberately. A sharp exchange between the 2 of them attributed to an anonymous temporary aide during the pandemic has no date, no place, and 1 newspaper behind it, and it is left out. A pet name he is supposed to have used for her is repeated everywhere and traceable to nobody. Neither is used here, and the reason is the same reason this film keeps naming its sources out loud. In a story about a household that was forbidden to speak, an invented quotation is not a small sin. What can be said, on the record, is what the husband himself said when somebody asked him the secret of a long marriage. "Have different interests," he answered. Then read the architecture through that sentence. A study laid out like a bridge, a library, a workshop, a separate office and a separate diary, a transistor radio and an electric frying pan and a grill at Balmoral, a carriage and 4 horses. Every one of those is the physical expression of a man who had told the world exactly what he thought marriage required, and then spent 73 years doing it in the same building as his wife. which is what makes the case of the man who sat in Michael Parker's chair so instructive, because in February 1957, the household discovered what it would do when one of its own became a liability. Chapter 8. A Servant's Marriage Paid for Theirs. The story that follows has been told for 70 years as a story about the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, and it is not one. It is a story about an employee. In the winter of 1956, the Duke left on a long solo voyage aboard the new royal yacht, opening the Olympic Games in Melbourne on the 22nd of November and sailing on south, crossing the Antarctic Circle at the end of December, the first member of royalty to do it, and coming home through the South Atlantic in the new year. He was away for about 4 months and travelled something over 40,000 miles. What that voyage was, why he went, and what the newspapers made of his absence is a story of its own, and it belongs elsewhere. What belongs here is the man standing next to him on every deck and in every port. Michael Parker went with him, as he had gone everywhere with him for a decade. And while the two of them were at sea, Parker's own marriage came apart in London. On the 5th of February 1957, his wife Eileen Parker made public that she was ending the marriage. She was not a member of the household. She was a household wife, which is a different thing entirely, and it is the difference that destroyed her. Her access to the royal world was social and domestic rather than professional, and her experience of it was the experience of the women left at home while the men who worked for the Duke of Edinburgh went round the world with him. She published a memoir about those years in 1982. There is very little that can honestly be quoted from that book. Its most reliably reproduced claim is a small and rather human one, that Philip and her husband used the false names Murgatroyd and Winterbottom when they slipped out of the palace on an evening. And even that comes with a qualification, because Michael Parker publicly denied her account of it. Beyond that, its passages about the royal marriage itself cannot be verified, so they are not used here. The dates, though, are exact, and they move fast. Her separation announcement was on the 5th of February. On the 6th of February, 1957, at Gibraltar, as the royal yacht neared home, Michael Parker resigned as private secretary to the Duke of Edinburgh. He did it to keep the coming divorce publicity away from the royal household. A press photograph of the two old friends together at Gibraltar that day survives. The divorce followed in due course. A decree nisi was granted on the 28th of February 1958 on grounds of adultery, naming a co-respondent. James Orr took over the desk. That is the whole of it, and it is a small, ordinary, 20th century tragedy of the kind that happened in thousands of British households in the 1950s. A marriage failed. A man left his job over it. What makes it worth an entire chapter of a film about the royal marriage is the machinery visible in the gap between those two dates. One day, a wife announces a separation in London on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, at the mouth of the Mediterranean, her husband has resigned from royal service. Nobody had to be told what to do. There was no instruction, no ultimatum on the record, no palace statement demanding it. The household's own man simply understood, immediately and without prompting, that a divorce in the Duke of Edinburgh's private office was a threat to the Duke of Edinburgh's marriage, and removed himself. That is what a rule looks like when it has been fully absorbed. Nobody enforces it because nobody needs to. The rule that removed him was not a rule about scandal. Parker had not done anything to the Queen or to the Duke of Edinburgh. He had not sold a story or embarrassed anybody or been indiscreet. His offence, in the eyes of the household, was that his own private life had become newsworthy, and that a member of the Duke of Edinburgh's staff, whose name was in the divorce columns, would drag the Duke of Edinburgh's name in beside it. That is a standard almost nobody outside royal service has ever been held to. A man lost a career of 10 years and a friendship formed under fire in a war because his wife left him. His wife, incidentally, was held to the same standard and had never signed anything. Eileen Parker was not employed by anyone. She was married to a man who was, and that was enough to place her inside a system whose whole purpose was to make private lives invisible. When she eventually wrote about those years, decades later, she wrote from the position the household had put her in from the beginning, the outside. Whatever the book's value, it is not evidence about the royal marriage. She was not in the room for that. What she had was the position the household had put her in from the start, which was the position of a wife at home, while the man she was married to went round the world with somebody else's husband. There is a further reason the household closed ranks so quickly, and it is one this film has been building towards. 1957 was not a distant era in the story of royal confidentiality. It was 7 years after the household's founding trauma. In 1950, the governess who had raised the Queen and her sister had published a book about them, and the family had cut her off completely, and the whole institution had watched it happen. Every person working in the palace in February 1957 had that example in living memory. They knew exactly what the household did to somebody whose private circumstances brought royal names into print, whether or not it was their fault. Michael Parker did not need to be told what would happen. He had seen it. There was press speculation at the time, aimed at Philip, arising from the length of his absence and from the fact that his closest aide was now a man in a divorce court. The foreign papers ran it, and the palace, whose entire working method for a century had been to say nothing about anything, broke its own first rule and issued a public denial through the Queen's press secretary. It is quite untrue, the statement said, that there is any rift between the Queen and the Duke. One sentence. In 73 years of marriage, that is the only occasion on which the royal household ever commented publicly on the state of it, and the story that produced it is not this film's story. What matters here is the shape of the response and who paid for it. The couple were defended by a press office in London. The friendship was ended at a gangway in Gibraltar. The Duke of Edinburgh lost the man who had known him since before any of it, and the man lost his career, and his wife lost her marriage, and the marriage the whole exercise protected went on for another 64 years. Parker never said a hard word about any of it afterwards. He gave interviews until his death in 2001, and he spent them defending Philip, correcting the record about the Thursday Club, and repeating the sentence about the job Philip had given himself. Never let her down. There is a version of the royal household that looks, from the outside, like a group of servants keeping their employers' secrets. The February of 1957 shows the harder truth underneath it. The household was not a set of witnesses who happened to be discreet. It was a mechanism, and when the mechanism came under load, it did what mechanisms do. It found the weakest component, and it spent it. The friendship, for what it is worth, survived. Parker lived until December 2001, and went on defending the man he had served for the rest of his life. What did not survive was the arrangement that had made them useful to each other. The men who followed, Orr and Neville and McGrath and Hunt Davis and Miller Bakewell, were professionals hired into a professional post, and every one of them served with a discretion that made Parker's era look positively conversational by comparison. Something else changed too, and it changed in the same season. On the 16th of February 1957, the Queen flew out and the couple were reunited at Lisbon. 6 days later, on the 22nd of February, she issued letters patent, granting her husband the style and dignity of a Prince of the United Kingdom, a title the newspapers had always used for him, but which he had not formally held since renouncing his Greek and Danish titles 10 years earlier. Commentators have read the timing ever since as a public gesture of confidence in him after a difficult winter. The date is documented. The motive is inference. And the elevation had its own constitutional logic besides, so it is offered here as what it is. A fact and a widely held reading of it, not a proof of anything. But look at the pair of events together, and the household's method is complete. A servant is quietly removed. A statement is issued in London. A title is granted in February. 3 moves in 3 weeks, none of them explained to anybody, all of them producing the same effect. A marriage that had been the subject of international speculation was, by the end of the month, publicly and visibly intact. For the next 60 years, that mechanism would grow more sophisticated, more legal, and very much harder to escape. And every single public minute of the marriage it protected would be built, in advance, by people who were not in it. Chapter 9. 2 lifetimes, timed to the interval. There is a set of documents that describes exactly how a royal visit was built, and it is not secret, and almost nobody reads it. Every county in England has a Lord Lieutenant, the sovereign's representative there, and every lieutenancy publishes a handbook telling local organisers how the machinery works. Those handbooks are written in the household's own operative language, and they are the closest thing that exists to a published account of how the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh were moved through the world. The process began with an invitation, which went to the private secretary at Buckingham Palace. If it was accepted, the palace then took control of details that would astonish anyone who imagines a royal visit as a couple turning up somewhere. The household approved the wording of the plaque to be unveiled. It approved who would be presented. It approved the menu. It approved the speeches. Roughly 4 weeks before the day, a formal household reconnaissance was held on site. The handbooks name who came: the private secretary, the personal protection officer, a press officer from Buckingham Palace where appropriate, the police, and the deputy clerk to the lieutenancy. They walked the ground. Until that reconnaissance has taken place, one handbook states, everything is provisional. And afterwards, in the flat sentence that gives the whole system away, after a programme has been agreed by the household, it must not be changed. The programme itself was then written in 5-minute segments, not hours, not half hours. 5-minute blocks, each carrying the names of the people who would be met inside it, their biographical details, and the guest lists. Organisers had to supply, in writing, who was to be presented, where, and why, and what the royal visitor would see and do, and why. Only police-driven vehicles could form the motorcade. The royal visitor travelled with a private secretary or a lady in waiting and a personal protection officer throughout. Set that against 70 years of photographs, and the photographs change. Every public minute of the most famous marriage in the world was planned, in advance, in 5-minute blocks, by people who were not in it. The couple did not choose where to stand. They did not choose who to meet, or in what order, or for how long. They were briefed separately by 2 different offices and delivered to the same spot at the same moment, and photographed together, and then separated again. And there is a further asymmetry inside the staging that is easy to miss and very hard to unsee once noticed. She travelled with ladies in waiting. The role was a real job, and the women who held it are named in the record: Lady Susan Hussey, the Honourable Mary Morrison, Margaret Rhodes, the Countess of Airlie, Diana Lady Farnham from 1987, and the Duchess of Grafton as Mistress of the Robes. They handled correspondence, ran errands, carried messages, accompanied her on tours, and arranged among themselves the rotas of attendance that were called, in the household's own antique word, waiting. He, being a man, had no such attendance. He had equerries and a private secretary. Two people walking into the same room from two directions at the end of two entirely separate support structures. The convention that governed how they walked once they got there has been misdescribed for so long that the correction is worth stating clearly. There is no located palace rule, warrant, or order requiring the Duke of Edinburgh to walk any particular number of paces behind his wife. What existed was rank, fixed in September 1952, and a ceremonial convention flowing from it, in which the monarch heads a procession and the consort follows. It applied to formal occasions. It was frequently not observed at all. Photographs across the entire reign show the two of them side by side and arm in arm at engagements that were not ceremonial. So the image of a husband trailing his wife for 70 years is partly a myth. But it is a myth built on something true, because the ceremonial did place him behind her in public on the biggest days for his whole life. And no arrangement of that kind is neutral. What he did with the machinery, when he could reach it, was try to loosen it. The evidence for that comes from a press secretary who worked for the Queen in the 1990s. Charles Anson said Philip wanted to make the royal household and the monarchy less stuffy, not to have so much formality everywhere. He introduced the informal lunches for a dozen guests from all sorts of backgrounds, which the couple hosted together every 2 months, and which had not existed before him. And in 1970, on a tour of Australia and New Zealand, the family tried something that had never been done. Instead of driving past the crowds, they got out and walked into them. The walkabout, as it came to be called, is now so familiar that its strangeness has worn off, and it was designed with a precision that shows how carefully everything in this world was thought about. Princess Anne later explained the founding rule of it, and the explanation is a small masterpiece of institutional logic. "We never shook hands," she said. The theory was, you could not shake hands with everybody, so do not start. That is the world these two people lived in. A world in which the decision not to shake hands with anyone had to be reasoned out in advance, because to shake one hand was to owe the gesture to every hand in Britain forever. The departments that did the designing were, and are, publicly named, and their division of labour is worth setting out because it is routinely got wrong. The private secretary's office supports the sovereign in the constitutional, governmental and political duties of a head of state, and it organises the official programme, the speeches and the correspondence. That is the office that decides where the principal goes. The Lord Chamberlain's office is responsible for organising those elements of the programme that involve ceremonial activity or public-facing events, garden parties, state visits, royal weddings, the state opening of Parliament, the royal muse. That is the office that decides how the principal is seen when she gets there, and its day-to-day work is run by an official called the Comptroller, a post held across the reign by a succession of retired senior officers. The master of the households department handles everything involved in the official and private entertaining across all the royal residences, the hospitality, the catering, the housekeeping, the florists. That is the office that decides what is on the table. And royal communications, the press office, controls who is allowed to watch any of it. 4 departments, in 4 sets of rooms, dividing between them the movement, the appearance, the feeding, and the photographing of 2 human beings. The couple themselves appear in that structure as the object of the sentence rather than the subject of it. The press control alone is a study in method. Engagements are released about 8 weeks ahead through a published diary, and organisers are forbidden to publicise anything until the palace clears it. Operational notes go out 5 to 10 days before the day. Interview requests require at least 3 weeks' notice, on the stated ground that royal diaries are booked weeks and often months in advance. The involvement of any press, photography, or social media coverage on the day must be cleared by the household beforehand. Behind that sits the royal rota, a pool system formalised at the palace in the late 1970s and expanded through the 1980s to around 10 accredited national newspapers, with designated captains for overseas tours and the broadcasters alongside them. All rota material is made available to every outlet, which is the crucial detail because mandatory pooling means no photographer can ever sell an exclusive. The palace's levers are simple and entirely sufficient. It allocates the passes, it publishes the diary, it enforces the pooling, and a photographer who breaks the protocol is not admitted again. That is why there are so few surprising photographs of this marriage. Not because nothing surprising happened in front of a lens, but because the lenses were allocated. The clearest proof of how completely the household controlled the presentation of this marriage is what happened on the 4 occasions when the marriage itself was the occasion. The silver wedding fell on the 20th of November 1972, and the Queen marked it at the Guildhall with a joke about the machinery. Everybody, she said, would concede that on this of all days she should begin her speech with the words, "My husband and I." 25 years of joint appearances had turned a form of words into a national catchphrase, and she knew it, and she used it. The Golden Wedding, in November 1997, was staged across 2 days and 2 venues in a deliberately mirrored programme, and she described the choreography from the podium herself. On the 19th, at the Guildhall, he spoke, and she proposed the health of the host. On the 20th, at Banqueting House, the roles were reversed, and she spoke. Yesterday, she said, she had listened as Prince Philip spoke at the Guildhall, and she had then proposed their host's health. Today, the roles were reversed. What each of them chose to say, on the only occasions in 73 years when either of them publicly described the marriage, is worth setting down in full, because nothing else in the record comes close to it. He went first. The main lesson they had learnt, he told the Guildhall, was that tolerance is the one essential ingredient of any happy marriage. It might not be quite so important when things were going well, he added, but it was absolutely vital when the going got difficult. And then, characteristically, he handed the compliment away rather than accepting one. They could take it from him, he said, that the Queen had the quality of tolerance in abundance. She answered him the next day in a speech delivered in the autumn of the worst year the family had known, and she began by admitting a private detail about their working life. All too often, she said, Prince Philip had had to listen to her speaking, and frequently they had discussed her intended speech beforehand, and, as the room would imagine, his views had been expressed in a forthright manner. Then she said the sentence that outlived everything else either of them said about each other. "He is someone who does not take easily to compliments," she said, "but he has, quite simply, been my strength and stay all these years. And I, and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know." In the official text of that speech, the words strength and stay carry quotation marks. She was borrowing them. Research at a British university has traced the phrase to Milton, which makes it one of the very few documented occasions on which the Queen's speechwriting was demonstrably literary rather than departmental. She went looking for the words. She also used a phrase in that speech which describes the whole 73 years better than any biographer has managed. She spoke of the two of them as one working couple to another. By the diamond wedding of November 2007, the machine had learned to make the continuity itself the message. The service at Westminster Abbey was announced nearly 4 months in advance. Around 2,000 people attended, and among them were members of the original wedding party of 1947, a seamstress who had worked on the wedding dress and choristers who had sung at it. Photographs were recreated at Broadlands, where the honeymoon pictures had been taken 60 years before, and the Queen wore the same 3-strand pearls and the same chrysanthemum brooch she had worn in the pictures taken there in 1947. And by the platinum wedding of the 20th of November 2017, the first British royal couple ever to reach 70 years, there was almost nothing left to stage, and the household chose to say nothing at all. A private dinner at Windsor with family and friends. The bells of Westminster Abbey rung. 6 commemorative stamps using the engagement and wedding photographs, and no speeches from either of them. There was one official portrait, taken at Windsor by Matt Holyoake, in which the couple sit flanked by Gainsborough's portraits of George III and Queen Charlotte. The Queen wears a cream day dress made by her own dresser, and on it a brooch of yellow gold set with a carved ruby and diamonds designed by Andrew Gremer. Philip had given it to her in 1966. That was the entire statement. After 70 years, the household had reduced its account of the marriage to an object, chosen and briefed, sitting on a lapel where the cameras would find it. Everything about their public life was designed like that, carefully, defensively, and by committee. Which meant that when something real happened in front of a camera, there had to be somebody whose entire job was to make sure it went no further. For 21 years, that somebody was a naval officer who despised journalists. Chapter 10. The Abominable No Man. Commander Richard Colville was press secretary to the Queen from 1947 to 1968. He had no background in newspapers whatsoever, which was very much the point of appointing him. The historian Ben Pimlott, whose biography of the Queen remains the standard account of the period, described him as an unbending former naval officer who treated the press with a combination of distrust and lordly contempt, and who wielded what Pimlott called extraordinary negative power. Fleet Street gave him a nickname, and it is one of the great newspaper nicknames of the 20th century. They called him the Abominable No Man. His method can be sampled from a single letter. In May 1952, 3 months into the new reign, asked to allow filming of the Queen's arrival at Balmoral, he wrote back, "Since Her Majesty and her family are going to Balmoral privately for a short holiday, I do not think it at all appropriate." That was the whole of the answer, and there was no appeal from it. The remarkable thing about the Colville era is that it worked, and it worked because Fleet Street let it. Pimlott is blunt about the collusion. Editors carried wartime deference into the 1950s and judged that the public wanted only warm, comfortable and reassuring coverage of the royal family. A press office with no power to compel obedience obtained near total obedience for 21 years because the newspapers agreed with it. The consequence for this story is precise. During the first 2 decades of the reign, the decades in which the couple were young, in which the rows recorded by biographers took place, in which the surname Wound was open and raw, and in which a private secretary lost his career in a single day, essentially nothing reached the public at all. Anything genuinely private that happened in that marriage between 1952 and 1968 was known to a household bound to silence and a press corps that was not asking. There is exactly one exception, and it has already been given its sentence. In February 1957, after the speculation surrounding the Duke's long absence, the palace issued a public denial that there was any rift between the Queen and the Duke. It is the only occasion in the entire reign on which the machine spoke about the state of the marriage, and the fact that it was worth doing measures precisely how far the story had run. Colville retired in 1968, and the wall began to come down, though not by accident. His successor, William Heseltine, believed the monarchy needed to be sold to the public, and that television was how it would be done. The press secretaries who came afterwards are worth naming, because between them they cover the rest of the marriage. Michael Shea held the post from 1978 to 1987, through the years when the appetite for royal coverage became something nobody could control. Shea's own summary of the pressure is memorable. "Every working day of my 5 years at the palace," he said, "there was a questioning of who Prince Charles would marry." He tried, at one point, the direct approach, convening a special briefing of newspaper editors at Buckingham Palace to appeal for restraint in the coverage of the Princess of Wales. All but one editor came, and they were introduced to the Queen afterwards. And Pimlott's verdict on the exercise is that tabloid rivalry proved more powerful than appeals to editorial restraint. Charles Anson held the post from 1990 to 1997, which meant he was there for the worst years the family had. His description of working for the Queen has an unexpected warmth to it. "Not only was it an honour to work for her," he said, "it was great fun. The Queen was always a very direct person to deal with a strong, simple character and a brilliant listener." And Dickie Arbiter, press secretary between 1988 and 2000, left the only genuinely useful first-hand account of the couple in private ever produced by the press office. It is not a scandal, it is a picnic. At Loch Muick, on the Balmoral estate, Arbiter records that just 4 people sat down to lunch: the Queen, Prince Philip, the lady-in-waiting who was on duty, and himself. The Queen and her lady-in-waiting laid the table themselves, and after the meal, the Queen insisted on clearing it up. 4 people, a loch, a table laid by the sovereign, and the washing up done by a woman who owned the mountain. Arbiter also published a memoir in 2014, and the aftermath of it is instructive. His own literary agency states that the book reportedly prompted Buckingham Palace to institute stricter protocols regarding staff memoirs. A press secretary wrote a book about the job, and the household responded by making it harder for the next one. The pattern holds across the whole reign, and it can be traced in a short list of occasions when the surface broke and somebody was sent to repair it. In March 1954, during the long Commonwealth tour, a film crew in Australia captured a row between the couple. The reel was surrendered and destroyed, and it does not survive. The accounts differ on the names, the location, and the detail, so it is offered here as what is agreed rather than what is claimed. There was an incident, and there was a reel, and the reel is gone. In 1956, the Duke of Edinburgh cooperated with a documentary about his voyage and afterwards regretted it, and his own private secretary formally complained that the finished film implied the trip had been a spree rather than duty. An office defending its principal's dignity against a film its principal had agreed to. In July 2007, a promotional tape was cut out of sequence in such a way that the Queen appeared to walk out of a photographic sitting in a temper. The broadcaster's channel controller repeated the mistaken version to journalists on the 11th of July. The broadcaster apologized formally to the Queen on the 12th. The channel controller resigned. So did the head of the production company. In May 2016, at a Buckingham Palace garden party, the Queen told a senior police officer who had run security for a Chinese state visit that the officials had been very rude to the ambassador. She was filmed doing it by the accredited cameraman who covers the palace for British broadcasters, which is to say by the household's own pool operator. The palace response is a small classic of the form. "We do not comment on the Queen's private conversations," it said, before adding that the state visit had been extremely successful and that all parties had worked closely to ensure it proceeded smoothly. and in September 2021, 5 months after the Duke of Edinburgh died, the president of the family division ruled that his will be sealed for 90 years after a private hearing from which the press had been excluded. Counsel representing the public interest argued that media interest in royal matters was insatiable and highly intrusive, and that the benefits of a public hearing were wholly disproportionate. The judge keeps a safe. It contains 30 sealed royal wills, the earliest belonging to a prince who died more than a century ago. 4 decades apart, the same instinct. Something private became visible, and an institution went and retrieved it. But the largest example of all runs in the opposite direction, and it is the strangest episode in the whole history of this household, because on that occasion the family did not hide anything. They opened the door themselves, on purpose, and filmed what was behind it. Chapter 11. Inside the Hut. In March 1968, the family agreed to something they had never agreed to before and would never agree to again. They let a film crew in. The idea came from William Heseltine, the press secretary who believed the monarchy had to be sold, and from the producer John Brabourne. Richard Colville directed. Anthony J. wrote the script. Michael Flanders narrated. Filming began on the 8th of June 1968 at Trooping the Colour and continued until May 1969. And the advisory committee that governed what the cameras were allowed to keep was chaired by Prince Philip, who personally approved every scene. That single fact reframes the whole enterprise. The most intimate footage ever taken of this marriage exists because the husband organised it and signed off on it, shot by shot. 43 hours were filmed. They were cut to roughly 105 minutes. The Queen watched the finished film a month before it aired. It was broadcast on the 21st of June 1969, watched by 30.6 million people in Britain, about 3/4 of the population, and by something in the region of 350 million around the world. What the world saw was a barbecue. At Balmoral, Philip and Princess Anne cooked sausages and steak, while Charles made a salad dressing. The Queen dipped a finger in it, tasted it, and pronounced it too oily. Her husband, inspecting the meat on the grill, delivered a verdict on his own cooking against somebody else's in 6 words. "Good," he said of one piece. "This, as you see, is not." There was the Queen buying sweets and ice cream for Prince Edward and paying in coins, remarking that the disgusting, gooey mess was going to end up in the car. There was a family breakfast with the television on. There was a formal dinner at which she told an anecdote about a gorilla, exactly as anyone does at a dinner table. There was a cello string snapping close to a child's face, which is said to have been the only scene Philip objected to when he saw it. Nobody in the film is performing. That is what makes it extraordinary, and it is what made the people who understood television afraid of it. David Attenborough, then controller of one of the channels, wrote to the director with a warning that has been quoted ever since and has never been improved on. "The whole institution depends on mystique and the tribal chief in his hut," he wrote. "If any member of the tribe ever sees inside the hut, then the whole system of the tribal chiefdom is damaged and the tribe eventually disintegrates." He was not wrong, and the family came to think so too. But the most revealing line about the whole project came from the director himself, and it is the single best description of how the household actually worked that anyone has ever produced, from any position, in any decade. "I never asked for things which I thought would be in bad taste," Colville said. "Therefore there was never any question of asking for something that would have to be turned down. Read that twice." There was no censor in the room. There did not have to be. The man holding the camera had so completely absorbed what he was permitted to want that he never framed a request that would need refusing. That is how the silence around this marriage was maintained for 70 years. not by suppression most of the time, by people knowing. The critics of the day saw the danger immediately. One reviewer wrote that every institution which had so far attempted to use television to popularize or aggrandize itself had been trivialized by it. Another predicted that the public would love seeing the royal family as not essentially different from anyone else, and that in the not-so-long run familiarity would breed, if not contempt, familiarity. The film was shown in full for the last time in August 1977 during the Silver Jubilee celebrations, and then it went away. It was judged, in the phrase used afterwards, to be of its time and for its time. Protected by Crown copyright, it became effectively unwatchable. Through the 1990s, a researcher could see it only privately at the broadcaster's premises, on payment of a £35 fee, and with the permission of Buckingham Palace. It is universally described as having been banned by the Queen, and that is not established. The broadcaster's own careful wording is that it was buried in the archive, reportedly by royal decree. No published palace instruction has ever surfaced. The film is simply gone, and everybody understands why, and there is no document. In January 2021, it briefly came back. Somebody uploaded it to a video site under a false name. It took nearly 10,000 views before it was removed on a copyright claim by the broadcaster, which did not dispute making the claim and declined to comment further. For a few days, half a century after it was made, anyone in the world could watch the Queen of England tell her son that his salad dressing was too oily. Then it went back in the archive. It is worth asking what the film actually shows about the marriage, since it is the only footage of them off-duty that has ever existed, and the answer is disarmingly small. It shows two people who are entirely comfortable in each other's company and not especially interested in demonstrating it. He cooks, she tastes. He is brisk, she is dry. Neither of them looks at the other for approval. There is no visible tenderness in the modern sense, and no visible coldness either. What there is, in the flat language of an observational camera, is ease. That ease is not nothing. It is, in fact, the only unmediated evidence in this entire story. Everything else in the record has passed through somebody. A biographer, a courtier, an undercover reporter, a curator writing a catalogue entry. The 1969 film passed through Prince Philip's own advisory committee, which is a serious qualification, but it did not pass through a writer. Whatever the couple were doing at that grill, they were doing it in front of a lens that had been running for 11 months and had long since stopped being interesting to them. And then the family took it away, which tells its own story. There is a broader argument buried in that decision, and the critics of 1969 made it before anyone else. An institution that depends on distance cannot survive intimacy, and every attempt to close the gap between the public and the family has cost the family more than it gained. Attenborough said it in a letter. A newspaper columnist said it in a review, predicting that familiarity would breed, if not contempt, familiarity. Within a generation, both of them were being quoted as prophets. What is less often noticed is what the decision cost this particular subject. By withdrawing the film, the household removed the only honest visual record of the marriage from public circulation, and left in its place 50 years of photographs taken at engagements that had been planned in 5-minute blocks. The version of Elizabeth and Philip that the world knows, two people standing a careful distance apart on a windy dais, is not a candid image of a marriage. It is the output of the Lord Chamberlain's office. By the time of that takedown, the machinery had grown considerably more formal than a copyright claim, because in the decades between the barbecue and the leak, the household had been to court, repeatedly, and it had won. Chapter 12. People in positions of confidence must be utterly oyster. In April 1949, 2 years into the marriage and 3 years before the accession, the Queen's mother sat down to write to a woman called Marion Crawford. Crawford had been governess to the two princesses from 1933 to 1949, 16 years. She had delayed her own marriage in order to stay with them. She was, by any ordinary measure, part of the family in the way that long-serving staff sometimes become part of a family, which is to say, completely and not at all. She was leaving, and there had been American offers of money for her story, and the letter she received laid down a doctrine that has governed the British royal household ever since. People in positions of confidence with us, it read, must be utterly oyster. The letter urged her to say no, no, no to offers of dollars for articles, while conceding that anonymous assistance would be quite all right as long as her name did not come into it. It is a remarkable document because it contains both the rule and the loophole, and it makes perfectly clear which of the two mattered. Crawford published anyway, under her own name, articles in an American magazine in early 1950, serialization in a British women's weekly for £30,000, and a book that became a bestseller. The consequences were absolute. The family never spoke to her again. She lost her grace and favour home. When a column she had written in advance described royal events that had in the end been cancelled, her credibility as a journalist collapsed too. She attempted suicide after her husband's death. And when she died in 1988, no member of the royal family sent a wreath to her funeral. Her name became the household's private verb for betrayal, and it is still in use. That was the warning. What followed was the enforcement, and it escalated steadily across the whole length of this marriage. In 1959, a footman in the Queen Mother's household, who had been attached to Princess Margaret, wrote a book about it. Her lawyers obtained an injunction. He was barred from profiting from it, left Britain, and published abroad, where the book appeared with a line on the jacket advertising itself as the book the royal family banned in England. Between 1985 and 1992, a woman called Wendy Berry was housekeeper at Highgrove to the Prince and Princess of Wales. She had signed a strict confidentiality agreement when she took the job. When she wrote about what she had seen, Prince Charles obtained an injunction in 1995 banning publication in the United Kingdom, and the court awarded him her profits. The book came out in the United States only. And then, in 2003, the household went to the High Court over a footman and won a ruling that ended the argument permanently. The footman was Ryan Parry, the newspaper reporter whose 2 months inside Buckingham Palace produced almost every detail of the daily routine described earlier in this story. On the 20th of November, 2003, the Queen obtained a High Court injunction against his newspaper, binding on all media. The judgment is the thing that matters. Mr. Justice Lewison found that the Queen had a real prospect of showing that Parry had breached the confidentiality terms in his employment contract, and held that contractual rights could be an exception to the principle of freedom of expression under the Human Rights Act. Counsel for the Attorney General argued that the breach had caused obvious and unjustified intrusions into the Queen's private life. A security review followed, conducted by a senior judge. That ruling is the keystone of everything in this film. It established, in open court, that the confidentiality clause signed by every member of the royal household is a contract the courts will enforce, and that it can outrank the right to free expression. It is the reason that nobody who has worked in the Queen's private apartments has published since. Set the two halves of the system side by side, and the design becomes visible. At one end, injunctions, seized profits, a High Court ruling, and a woman who died without a wreath. At the other end, the Royal Victorian Order, at the personal gift of the sovereign, outside the reach of any government, in 5 grades with medals beneath them and clasps at 20, 30, and 40 years of service. punishment on one side, decoration on the other, and between them, several hundred people a year deciding correctly that the second was the better bet. The best demonstration that the system worked by consent rather than by fear is not in the courtrooms at all. It is at sea. The royal yacht was in service for 44 years, from 1954 to 1997, and it carried the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh around the world for the whole of that time. It was also, by the standards of a palace, tiny. The men who scrubbed the 2-inch teak decks every morning, who dived on the seabed before an arrival, who arranged the flowers and polished the silver and did the laundry in temperatures that reached 120 degrees, were at sea with this marriage for weeks at a time. Every one of them was hand-picked by the commanding officer. About half served a 2-year tour, and the rest stayed for their entire careers, turning down promotion to other ships in order to remain, and waiting in the queue they themselves had named after dead men's shoes. Think about what that self-selection produced. The people who saw the most had chosen, deliberately, to structure their whole naval careers around staying where they were. They had the most to lose by leaving, let alone by talking. And the result is exactly what the honours ladder would predict. In 44 years, on a ship of 240 men, not one named member of that crew has ever published an account of the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh's private life aboard. Even the most famous line attributed to her about the yacht cannot be verified. She is supposed to have said it was the one place she could truly relax, and that sentence is quoted everywhere, and there is no primary source for it and no agreed wording. It may well be something she felt. There is no evidence she ever said it. What is documented is the day they took the ship away. At the decommissioning at Portsmouth on the 11th of December 1997, the Queen was visibly tearful, and the picture ran everywhere as a rare crack in 70 years of composure. Her husband dealt with it in a single stroke years later, talking to Giles Brandreth. "The Queen does not cry," he said. And then, because that was not quite enough, "It was the middle of December," he snorted. "It was bloody cold. They all had tears in their eyes." That exchange is a miniature of this entire film, a moment of visible human feeling, in public, immediately reframed by somebody standing close enough to do it. Usually the reframing came from a press office. On that occasion it came from her husband, which is arguably the most revealing detail of all, because it means the instinct to manage the image of this marriage did not only belong to the staff, it belonged to the couple. They had been doing it, between them, since 1952. Which brings this story back to the man in the corridor. Paul Wybrew served Elizabeth II for 40 years as page of the backstairs, a post whose title descends from the pages of the bedchamber, and whose meaning is simply that its holder goes where nobody else goes. He was there on the morning Michael Fagan walked into her bedroom. He appeared alongside her in a film shown to the world at the opening of the Olympic Games in 2012. He walked in her funeral procession in September 2022. He holds a silver medal from 1993, a decoration from 2006, a higher one from 2012, a gold medal from 2016, a commandership from 2023, and a long and faithful service medal with 2 clasps marking 40 years. He has never given an interview. He has never published a word. He has never made a public statement of any kind about the Queen, about the Duke of Edinburgh, or about their marriage. 4 decades in the 2 rooms this entire film is about, and the complete record of what he saw consists of 6 pieces of metal. The system worked. That is the plain finding, and it should be sat with rather than hurried past, because it means the honest answer to the question in the title cannot come from a servant's memoir. There isn't one. It has to be assembled from a handful of quotations, a curator's catalogue, a court judgment, a barbecue nobody is allowed to watch, and the dates on which two elderly people were in the same building. Before leaving the subject, one correction is owed to the people most often wheeled out to speak for this household, because it matters for everything that has been said so far. A great many of the voices heard in documentaries about this marriage were never anywhere near it. Grant Harold, who speaks with genuine authority and real affection about the Duke of Edinburgh, was butler to the Prince of Wales from 2004 to 2011, based at Highgrove in Gloucestershire. He is an excellent witness to Philip's character. He is not a witness to the private apartments of Buckingham Palace, and he has never claimed to be. What he can say is worth hearing on its own terms. He was blunt, Harold said, and he was not everyone's cup of tea. He did not mince his words. If he swore at you, he swore at you, and people liked it when he swore at you. Told that the household was a big organisation with a great many people telling him where to go and when, Philip's response was a single word. Why? Ken Wharf was a police protection officer, first to the Duke of Kent, then to the young princes, then to the Princess of Wales from 1987 until 1993. He never served in the Queen's household or the Duke's. Paul Burrell was a footman at Buckingham Palace and became the Queen's own before moving to the household of the Prince and Princess of Wales in 1987. He is therefore a real witness to the Queen's private apartments, but only up to that year, and his credibility is contested in the sharpest terms by the family. He does have one usable memory of the couple together, and it is a kind one. He married a maid of the Duke of Edinburgh's at the Queen's own encouragement, and he remembered afterwards that the Queen and the Duke were delighted, that they took the couple into their sitting room, and that they gave them a pair of candlesticks and a clock. And the biographers most quoted on this marriage, Giles Brandreth and Ingrid Seward and Sarah Bradford and Philip Ede and Sally Bedell Smith, are not household staff at all. They are the pipe through which almost all surviving staff testimony reaches the world, charterists above all, and that is a valuable function and a different one. A biographer's line is not a servant's line. Strip out everyone who was not in the room, in other words, and the list of genuine witnesses to this marriage shrinks back to the handful named at the beginning of this story, which is exactly where it started, and exactly the point. And it is the dates, in the end, that give it away. Because in August 2017, the arrangement that had held for 65 years changed completely, and for the first time in the marriage, the distance between them stopped being a matter of doors and became a matter of miles. Chapter 13. 110 miles apart. He had been warning them for years, in his own way, which is to say bluntly and without asking anybody's permission. In an interview broadcast for his 90th birthday in June 2011, Prince Philip was asked about carrying on. "I reckon I have done my bit," he said. "So I want to enjoy myself a bit now, with less responsibility." And then, in the sentence that turned out to be a timetable, "It is better to get out before you reach the cell by date." He was candid in the same conversation about the reason. "Your memory is going," he said. "I cannot remember names and things." Asked whether he considered his role a success, he gave the answer that had been his position for 60 years. "I could not care less," he said. "Who cares what I think about it?" 6 years later, on the 4th of May 2017, Buckingham Palace issued a statement, and the wording is worth reading exactly as written rather than as it was reported. His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh has decided that he will no longer carry out public engagements from the autumn of this year. In taking this decision, the Duke has the full support of the Queen. He would keep the engagements already in the diary until August. He would accept no new invitations after that, He remained patron, president, or member of more than 780 organizations with which he would continue to be associated. And Her Majesty, the statement concluded, will continue to carry out a full program of official engagements. That last line is the whole story of the next 3 years, and it was published on the day. He was 95, she was 91. He was stopping, and she was not. The phrase about her support has been read 100 ways since, and it should be read as none of them. It is palace language. It means what palace language always means, which is that the sentence has been drafted so that nothing can be inferred from it. Whether she was pleased, relieved, sad, or wholly indifferent is not in that document and is not anywhere else either. What is on the record is his own remark that afternoon, at a reception at St. James's Palace, when the mathematician Sir Michael Atiyah, then 88 himself, told him he was sorry to hear he was standing down. "Well," said Philip, "I cannot stand up much longer." He worked through the summer. The last one came on Wednesday, the 2nd of August, 2017, on the forecourt of Buckingham Palace, where a parade of Royal Marines had gathered to mark the end of a challenge in which they had run 1,664 miles in 100 days, the number chosen for the year the Corps was founded. He came out as their Captain General, aged 96, in a bowler hat in torrential rain, and stood in it. Told what the Marines had done, he gave them the send-off he had been giving people for 70 years. "You all should be locked up." Then it was finished. By the palace's own count, 22,219 solo engagements since 1952, about 5,500 speeches, 637 solo overseas visits, 65 years, and he went to Norfolk. Wood Farm is a 5-bedroom farmhouse on the Sandringham estate, standing in a secluded position looking out towards the sea, about 2 miles from the big house and half a mile from a small railway station. It is Norfolk vernacular, 2 floors, an L-shaped plan, plain brickwork, and nothing about it announces anything. It has a history in the family. George V's youngest son lived there from 1917 to 1919, and the household began using it again in 1967. Philip chose it for a specific reason, and the reason explains the last 4 years of his life. Family and guests could use it without the large staff or the expense of the main house. He put his own watercolours on the walls. He redesigned the kitchen and the bedrooms, and had a new kitchen installed shortly after retiring. He drove himself around the estate in a Land Rover. He kept the live-in staff to a minimum on purpose. And at Wood Farm, the servants did not wear uniform. That is the smallest detail in this entire film, and possibly the most eloquent. A man who had spent 65 years inside the most formally dressed household in the world, walking behind his wife past ranks of people in livery, arranged his own retirement so that nobody in the building had to dress up. The Queen came and cooked and washed up. That is on the record too, and it is a strange sentence to write about a woman of 90. Darren McGrady, the chef, had known the house in the earlier years and remembered it with real affection. "I used to love it there," he said. "It is so small you get to interact with them every day, rattle pans and play with the corgis." But he was there, and she was not, and that is the fact this film has been walking towards since the first minute. On the 20th of November 2019, their 72nd wedding anniversary, the Duke of Edinburgh was at Wood Farm, aged 98, and the Queen was in London, aged 93, holding audiences with the ambassadors of Suriname and the Kyrgyz Republic. 110 miles apart, on the anniversary of a wedding at Westminster Abbey. How that arrangement should be read is the one genuinely contested question in this story, and the 2 leading biographers of the reign disagree about it in print. Hugo Vickers takes the harder line. Philip was at his happiest at Wood Farm, he writes, and he more or less settled there. And in the course of the next 2.5 years, that was his home. He enjoyed his carriage driving. He read voraciously. He painted a little. The Queen, Vickers says, gave him a loose rein and allowed him to do exactly as he pleased. And, in Vickers' phrase, in a sense they separated. Those 4 words have been detached from that paragraph and run as headlines for years, and it is worth noticing what is being cut when they are, in a sense. He is describing a domestic arrangement. He is not describing the end of a marriage, and the qualifier is his, not a defence lawyer's. Giles Brandreth reads the same facts and reaches the opposite conclusion. The arrangement, he writes, shocked some people, though not those who appreciated how well the Queen understood her husband, understood his wish to be left to his own devices, not to be fussed over, to be allowed, after more than 70 years of duty, to see out his days in his own way. A courtier quoted anonymously in the British press put it in the plainest terms of all. "The Queen feels the Duke has earned a proper retirement," he said. "She knows him too well. If he was still at the centre of royal life, he would feel he had to be involved. And here the honest thing to do is admit how little anybody knows." There is no reliable record of how often the Queen went to Wood Farm between August 2017 and March 2020. The court circular records her engagements, not her weekends. The claims that circulate, that she went up by train most weekends, that they spoke on the telephone every day, are repeated everywhere and attached to nobody. There is no sourced figure for how many staff lived at Wood Farm either, only the fact that there were very few of them and that they wore no uniform. What is documented is thinner and more ordinary. He divided his time between Wood Farm and Windsor Castle, so he was never permanently in Norfolk. And they were together for the fixed points of the royal year. Christmas at Sandringham, including the Christmas of 2019, which he reached the day after coming out of hospital, and the summers at Balmoral. So the picture is a marriage of 2 houses and a shared calendar, in the 10th decade of 2 lives. And the people arguing about what it meant are all working from the outside. There is one more name attached to those Norfolk years, and it should be dealt with carefully and then left alone. Penelope Knatchbull, born Penelope Eastwood in April 1953, married Norton Knatchbull, who was Philip's cousin and godson, and became Countess Mountbatten of Burma in 2017. She and Philip met in the 1970s. After he gave up polo in 1971, he took up carriage driving and he taught her the sport, and she competed and drove alongside him on many occasions over the following decades. By the time of his death, a newspaper described a friendship of nearly 30 years and reported that she appeared on his guest lists so consistently that the household had given her a nickname. They called her, and also. She was a regular visitor to Wood Farm in his retirement. She was one of the 30 people at his funeral, chosen personally by the Queen, and she attended in part as the representative of her husband, who was too ill to be there. That is the entirety of what is documented. There has been speculation about the friendship for years, and the fairest published summary of it is that although there has been speculation that a romantic relationship could at one time have existed, there is no evidence to confirm it. She has never given an interview on the subject. A television drama built an entire storyline out of it, and a drama is not evidence. So the record shows a horsewoman, a family connection by marriage, 3 decades of a shared sport that almost nobody else at that level would take up, a nickname coined by staff, and a seat at a funeral given her by the widow. Anyone who wants to build something else on that is building it themselves. The other thing the Norfolk years contained was the slow failure of a body that had been treated like machinery for 98 years. on Thursday the 17th of January 2019, aged 97, driving alone with no bodyguard in the car, he collided with another vehicle at a crossroads near Sandringham. A woman of 49 in the passenger seat of the other car broke her wrist. The driver hurt her knee. A baby of 9 months in the back was unhurt. He was breath-tested and clear, and he was not injured. 10 days later, he wrote to the injured woman personally, and the letter is the only document in this entire story in which Prince Philip apologizes for anything. "I am very contrite about the consequences," he wrote. The sun was shining low over the main road. In normal conditions, I would have no difficulty in seeing traffic coming from that direction, but I can only imagine that I failed to see the car coming. On the 9th of February, he voluntarily surrendered his driving license to the police. The Crown Prosecution Service decided not to prosecute. He went on driving on the estate roads, where the rules were his own, and was photographed doing it. There is a version of that story in which his wife made him give up the license. There is no evidence for it, and it is not repeated here. Then, in March 2020, the argument about the two houses was settled by a virus. Chapter 14. The year they finally lived together. On the 19th of March 2020, the Queen went to Windsor Castle a week earlier than planned, and a helicopter brought her husband from Sandringham to join her. Her public message that day began with a sentence nobody paid much attention to at the time, and which now reads as the opening line of the last chapter of a 73-year marriage. "As Philip and I arrive at Windsor today," she said, "we know that many individuals and families across the United Kingdom and around the world are entering a period of great concern and uncertainty. For the next 12 months, apart from 4 weeks in a hospital bed, they did not leave each other's company. The household that shut itself in with them was reduced to 22 people, and it acquired a name almost immediately. The master of the household, Vice Admiral Sir Tony Johnstone Burt, a former Royal Navy officer, sent a morale-raising note to the staff in which he called the arrangement HMS Bubble, and it stuck. His note is unexpectedly moving. The challenges they were facing, he told the staff, had parallels with being at sea away from home for many months. "It is rather like a ship," he wrote, "that leans and rolls through water in a squall, but keeps going." The 22 included the Queen's private secretary, Sir Edward Young. It included Angela Kelly, the dresser. It included Paul Wybrew, the page. It included the head groom, Terry Pendry, who kept 2 meters away while preparing her ponies. Staff agreed to live apart from their own families for the duration, and those housed in the home park were driven in and out in a disinfected people carrier so that they touched nothing outside. The Queen's hairdresser could not come. Angela Kelly did her hair for a year. And in the middle of that reduced household, 2 people aged 93 and 98 simply lived together in one building for the first sustained period since a rented villa in Malta 70 years earlier. The record of where they were is unusually complete, because for once there was nothing else to report. They arrived at Windsor together on the 19th of March 2020. They left for Balmoral together on the 4th of August. They came down from Balmoral together on the 16th of September and went to Sandringham. They returned to Windsor in October. In December, the palace announced that, having considered all the appropriate advice, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh had decided that this year they would spend Christmas quietly at Windsor, which made it the first Christmas away from Sandringham in more than 30 years. On the 9th of January 2021, it was announced that both had been vaccinated at Windsor by a household doctor, a disclosure the Queen chose to make, according to a royal source, in order to prevent further speculation. Then the hospital, in February and March, which was the only substantial separation of the whole period, and then Windsor again, from the 16th of March until the 9th of April. Set end to end, that is about 12 months and 3 weeks under one roof, across 3 houses, broken only by 28 nights in a hospital bed. No named source has ever stated that this was the longest continuous stretch the couple ever spent together in the entire reign. And this film will not put those words in anybody's mouth. But the arithmetic is available to anyone who wants to do it. From February 1952 onwards, her working year moved between London and Windsor and Sandringham and Balmoral on a fixed cycle, with state visits and Commonwealth tours cut into it, and his diary ran in parallel and frequently in the opposite direction by design. There is no other period after 1951 in which the two of them were in the same building, day after day, with no engagements, for a year. Giles Brandreth, who knew Philip for decades, offered a 2-word verdict on the experience that is probably the truest thing anybody has said about it. It rather suited them. There are 3 photographs from that year, and between them they carry the whole of it. The first is from the 10th of June 2020, his 99th birthday, taken 2 days earlier in the quadrangle at Windsor. The two of them, outdoors, alone. The family could only send their wishes by video call, and the Prince of Wales, shut out like everybody else, summed up the year in 4 words. FaceTime, he said, is all very well. The second is from the 22nd of July 2020, and it is his last public engagement, though nobody knew it. He came out onto the equerry's entrance steps at Windsor, aged 99, to hand over the role of Colonel-in-Chief of the Rifles, a regiment he had led since it was formed in 2007, with an association going back through its predecessor regiments to 1953. 67 years. 4 buglers of the regiment sounded the last post for him. A simultaneous ceremony took place 100 miles away, because the rules of that summer would not allow the 2 halves of the occasion to stand in the same place. He spoke to each of the 4 buglers individually to thank them. The third photograph was released on the 17th of November 2020 for their 73rd wedding anniversary. It was taken in the Oak Room at Windsor, the white-panelled sitting room in the private apartments, and it shows the two of them examining a homemade anniversary card made for them by 3 of their great-grandchildren. The Queen is wearing the chrysanthemum brooch, set with sapphires and diamonds. It is the same brooch she wore for the honeymoon photographs at Broadlands in November 1947. 73 years, in one lapel, in a private room, with a card made out of coloured paper by 3 children who could not come and see them. That is the last anniversary. What came after it was 4 weeks in a hospital bed, and they are worth setting down in sequence, because the sequence is the only part of the last year in which the couple were apart, and because of what it cost her. On Tuesday, the 16th of February 2021, he was admitted to King Edward VII's Hospital in London on his doctor's advice after feeling unwell. He walked in unaided. The palace described him as being in good spirits and the admission as a precaution. He stayed. On the 20th of February, the Prince of Wales drove up from Gloucestershire to see him, and he was the only member of the family who visited. On the 1st of March, he was transferred by ambulance across London to St Bartholomew's for testing and treatment of a heart condition he had lived with for years. On the 3rd of March, he underwent what the palace called a successful procedure for a pre-existing heart condition, and did not name the procedure. On the 5th of March, he was moved back to the first hospital to convalesce, and on Tuesday, the 16th of March 2021, he was discharged and driven home to Windsor Castle. 28 nights, 4 weeks. By a wide margin, the longest hospital stay of his life, at 99 years old, in the middle of a pandemic, with his wife waiting at Windsor. The statement issued on his discharge is a small, dry, very characteristic document. and it contains the last public words attributed to him. His Royal Highness, it said, wishes to thank all the medical staff who looked after him at both hospitals and everyone who has sent their good wishes. He had 24 days left. That hospital stay is the cleanest test in the whole story of what this marriage had become. For a year, the two of them had lived in the same building by choice, with 22 people and nothing else in it. Then, for 4 weeks, one of them was taken away to London, and the other could not follow, could not visit, could not sit in the room. A 94-year-old woman waited out a month in a castle, while her husband of 73 years was moved between 2 hospitals, and the only family member who visited him was their son. Then he came home, and she was there. And 24 days later, he died in the house they had spent the year in. Whatever the newspapers had been writing since 2017 about a couple who lived apart, that is not how the last year of this marriage was actually spent. Chapter 15. 30 places, and none for the men who dressed him. He died on the morning of Friday the 9th of April 2021 at Windsor Castle, aged 99, 2 months short of his 100th birthday. The announcement came from the palace at noon, and it is a short document, and every word of it was chosen. It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen has announced the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. Her beloved husband. In 73 years of institutional language, that is close to the warmest phrase the machine ever issued about the marriage, and it took a death to produce it. The cause given on the death certificate was old age, certified by the head of the royal medical household. Whether she was in the room is disputed, and it will be left disputed here. Contemporaneous reporting said she was at his bedside. A biography published 5 years later says she was not, and quotes her as having been furious that, as so often in life, he left without saying goodbye. The two accounts cannot both be right, neither can be checked, and a film about the perils of unsourced royal claims is not going to pick one. His daughter-in-law Sophie, the Countess of Wessex, spoke to reporters outside the chapel in Windsor Great Park 2 days later, after a private service, and gave the only description of his death that any member of the family has offered. It was so gentle, she said. It was just like somebody took him by the hand, and off he went. Very, very peaceful. She was asked about the Queen, and answered in a sentence that anybody who has watched a widow will recognize. She has been amazing, she said, and she is thinking of others before herself. The Queen's own words about it reached the public at one remove. Prince Andrew, speaking at Windsor on the 11th of April, reported his mother's phrase for what had happened to her. She had described it, he said, as having left a huge void in her life. That is her language, relayed by her son, and it should always be attributed that way, because she never said it publicly herself. The funeral was on Saturday the 17th of April 2021 at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, and it was a royal ceremonial funeral rather than a state one. It began at 20 minutes to 3 in the afternoon. At 2:45, the coffin left the quadrangle, carried on a modified Land Rover Defender, painted in a shade he had specified himself and called Edinburgh Green, fitted with rubber grips to hold the coffin in place. He had begun designing it in 2003 and finished in 2019. 16 years, on a vehicle he would use once. Royal Marines piped the side at 7 minutes to 3. The country stood in silence at 3 o'clock. The music had been chosen by him, and because of the rules of that spring, attendance was capped at 30 people. They wore masks. They sat 2 meters apart, grouped by household. They were not permitted to sing, which is why the Queen sat alone, and why the photograph of a 94-year-old woman in a black mask on an empty pew became the defining image of the pandemic monarchy. Now count who was in the chapel, because the count is the point. There was the Queen, her 4 children, her grandchildren and their partners, her nephew and her nieces, her cousins. 3 German princes, Bernhard of Baden, Donatus of Hesse, and Philip of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, and Penelope Knatchbull, Countess Mountbatten of Burma, the carriage-driving companion of his last 30 years, chosen personally by the Queen, and attending in part on behalf of her husband, who was too ill to come. 30 places. Every one of them filled by blood, by marriage, or by family friendship. Not one of them by service. Set that against the household this film has spent 2 hours describing, and the arithmetic is brutal. Several hundred people had worked for this man across 70 years. 6 had run his office. 2 had washed and dressed him through his last illness. A page had spent 40 years within a few yards of his wife. Every one of them had signed away the right to describe any of it, and most had been decorated for keeping to the bargain. And when the man they served was carried out of the quadrangle on a vehicle he had spent 16 years designing, they stood outside in the open air, and 30 seats went to family. There was no malice in it. The number was set by a government regulation about a virus, and if there had been 300 places rather than 30, the household would still have been outside, because that is where the household always is. The pandemic did not create the arrangement. It simply removed everything else, and left the arrangement standing on its own, visible for once, in a courtyard at Windsor on a Saturday afternoon. The music inside had been chosen by him. The vehicle outside had been built by him. And the men who had spent their careers making both of those things possible listened to the service through a wall. Brigadier Archie Miller Bakewell had been Philip's private secretary for 11 years. He had run his diary, managed his retirement, and registered his death. He walked in the funeral procession, in the open, behind the coffin he had helped arrange. He is not on the published list of 30, nor is any other member of the household. Some accounts place 1 or 2 of them inside the chapel, and the published list does not. And that disagreement can be left where it is, because the shape of the day is not in dispute. The staff were at Windsor. They were in the procession and on the forecourt. The 30 seats went to family. Angela Kelly described what the household looked like that afternoon from where she was standing. The Queen's dressers, pages, chefs, housemaids, footmen and castle attendants, she wrote, all stood to attention as the Duke of Edinburgh's coffin was carefully placed onto the Land Rover that he had specially designed for the day, standing to attention on a forecourt while 30 people went inside. He had not forgotten them. His will left bequests to 3 long-serving members of his personal staff, Miller Bakewell, his page William Henderson, and his valet Stephen Niedoyadlo, from an estate reported at around £30 million. It is a rare public acknowledgement of personal service by a member of the royal family, and it is known only through reported accounts, for a reason that arrived 5 months later. And none of the 3 has ever given an interview, or published a line, or said anything at all. 5 months later, on the 16th of September 2021, the President of the Family Division of the High Court ruled that the will itself be sealed for 90 years, following a private hearing from which the media had been excluded. The Attorney General, representing the public interest, argued that media interest in royal matters was insatiable and highly intrusive, and that the benefits of a public hearing were wholly disproportionate. The judge, who keeps a safe containing 30 sealed royal wills, said that as much detail as possible should be made public, short of compromising the privacy conventionally afforded to communications from the sovereign. So even the bequests are known only through reported accounts, not from the document. That is the last act of the machine that had surrounded this marriage from the beginning. Not a denial, not an injunction, not a copyright claim. A safe, a private hearing, and 90 years. Angela Kelly was waiting when the Queen came back to the castle that afternoon, and she recorded the only description anyone has of the return, and it is 3 sentences long. "I helped her off with her coat and hat," she wrote, and no words were spoken. The Queen then walked to her sitting room, closed the door behind her, and she was alone with her own thoughts. Chapter 16. What the Household Really Saw. She lived for another 17 months, and what she did in them answers the question this film has been asking better than any of the testimony. 4 days after the funeral, it was her 95th birthday, and she issued a written statement thanking the country for its kindness. She said that while the family was in a period of great sadness, it had been a comfort to see and hear the tributes paid to her husband. She was, by every account, steady in public and busy on purpose. Brandreth records her private formulation about grief, and it sounds exactly like her. "There is no magic formula," she said, "that will transform sorrow into happiness, but being busy helps." In November 2021, she spoke by video to a climate summit in Glasgow and used the platform to hand him something. This was a duty she was especially happy to discharge, she said, because the impact of the environment on human progress had been a subject close to the heart of her dear late husband, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Then she quoted a warning he had given about pollution more than 50 years earlier. At Christmas, she made her broadcast from Windsor, and it was the most personal she ever recorded. Beside her, on the desk, she placed a single framed photograph of the 2 of them. She wore the sapphire chrysanthemum brooch from the honeymoon, and she talked about him in the present tense of memory rather than the past tense of duty. That mischievous, inquiring twinkle, she said, was as bright at the end as when I first set eyes on him. She called him irrepressible and spoke of his capacity to squeeze fun out of any situation, and called him her beloved Philip, and then said the thing that a great many people watching had been waiting 70 years to hear a monarch say out loud. "Christmas can be hard for those who have lost loved ones," she said. "This year, especially, I understand why." Then, in January 2022, she went to Norfolk. Not to Sandringham House, where the family always went, and where the estate and the staff and the ceremony were. She went to Wood Farm, the small brick farmhouse with 5 bedrooms and his watercolours on the walls, where the servants wore no uniform, and she stayed there for several weeks. It was her first overnight stay in that house since before he died. It was the house that had been his and not hers, the address that had put 110 miles between them on their 72nd anniversary, the place that produced every headline about a marriage that had quietly ended. She went there, and she stayed. On the 29th of March 2022, at Westminster Abbey, there was a service of thanksgiving for him, with around 1,800 people in it, everything the pandemic had denied him a year earlier. Young people from his award scheme lined the Abbey steps. She came in by a side door on the arm of her second son, and then walked to her seat unaided at 95. And the congregation sang a hymn he had asked for and had not been allowed at his funeral, because in April 2021, nobody had been permitted to sing. She died at Balmoral on the 8th of September 2022, aged 96. Her death certificate, like his, gave the cause as old age. On the evening of the 19th of September, his coffin was brought out of the royal vault at St. George's, and the 2 of them were interred together in the King George VI Memorial Chapel. There is a detail about that final journey that belongs at the end of this story rather than the middle of it. When she died at Balmoral, her husband had been lying in the royal vault beneath St. George's Chapel for 17 months. He had been placed there in April 2021, as a temporary measure, a resting place recorded from the beginning as temporary. On the evening of her funeral, after the cameras had gone and the country had stopped watching, his coffin was brought up out of the vault, and the two of them were put into the King George VI Memorial Chapel together in a private service with only the family present. 73 years of marriage, conducted in front of several hundred employees and photographed at every stage by a rota of accredited newspapers. And the last thing that happened to the two of them happened in a small side chapel at 7:30 in the evening with nobody watching at all. So what did the household really see? They saw a marriage arranged, from beginning to end, by other people. 2 bedrooms in 1 suite, because a Victorian architect drew it that way, and a Prime Minister insisted they live in it. 2 offices with 2 private secretaries because there was no precedent for a male consort and nobody had built him a chair. 2 lifetimes of public appearances assembled in 5-minute blocks by 4 departments and delivered to the same square yard of pavement at the same moment. A press office that broke its silence about the state of the marriage exactly once in 73 years. A film of the two of them at a barbecue, made with the husband's approval and locked away for half a century. 2 houses at the end, 110 miles apart, and a will sealed for 90 years. If distance were the same thing as estrangement, the case would be closed. But the same people saw the rest of it, and the rest of it is what they left on the record when they were finally allowed to speak. A curator's catalogue describing a breakfast room where the two of them ate alone, and a working room hung with his paintings. A chef describing a couple who sent every servant out so that a man could stand at a stove. A footman describing a candlestick and a clock. A press secretary describing 4 people at a picnic by a loch, and a queen clearing the table. A courtier describing the one man on earth who talked to her like a person. A dresser describing a closed door and a woman alone with her thoughts. A great-grandchild's homemade card in a white-panelled room. A brooch from 1947, worn again in 2020 and again at that final Christmas. And a woman of 95 going to sleep for several weeks in a small farmhouse in Norfolk that had never been hers. The distance was real. The estrangement was not. And the proof of it was in the hands of a housemaid, a page, a valet, and a private secretary, every one of whom had signed a contract, taken a medal, and gone quietly to the grave or to the chapel door without saying so. Paul Wybrew served her for 40 years in those rooms. He was the man who came when a stranger got into her bedroom on a July morning in 1982, walking the dogs, arriving before anyone else, and standing there while the police took the intruder away. He walked in her funeral procession 40 years later. He has 5 decorations and a service medal with 2 clasps, and has never published one word about either of them. He knows the answer. So did the housemaid in the corridor. They were not permitted to give it, and so the closest thing to a verdict on this marriage that will ever exist was left by a private secretary who never wrote a book, in a remark made to a biographer who wrote it down, about a woman he had watched for 25 years, and about the mornings she walked out of her own rooms and into her husband's to eat cereal out of a plastic tub. "Prince Philip," said Martin Charteris, "is the only man in the world who treats the Queen simply as another human being. He is the only man who can. Strange as it may seem, I believe she values that. If this one held you, then subscribe, because there are more of them coming, all told from inside the household rather than from the throne. And tell me down in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what you make of it. Do you think separate bedrooms tell you anything real about a marriage, or nothing at all? I read every reply, and you are the reason this channel exists.